Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 541. Genevieve. Seth had reached the northern shore of Earth just 2 or 3 hours after setting off from Hyperborea. However, his friends were not there. Thanks to the cloak of Hecate, he quickly realized that his party had rashly entered Sigma. He didn't exactly know why, but he suspected Lena was behind that. After indoctrinating the beastmen for a long time, Mike would not have made such a dangerous decision himself. With a sigh, the blacksmith also took course at Sigma. What else was he supposed to do? Let them risk their lives on their own while he waited outside? He had no intention to discredit their strength. Seth knew how strong they all were. After all, he was the one who covered them in luxurious equipment. Still, he was worried. As for himself, he had the helm of Hades. He could run at any time if he met an overwhelming opponent. There was only a small problem. The direction he got from the cloak of Hecate was a little rough, especially if the destination was something as vague as the place where my friends are. It worked the best with a fixed goal in an environment with limited choices like that of a dungeon. But when facing a big area like Sigma or Hyperborea, he could ascertain the rough direction at best. Unfortunately, there was nobody to ask. The city was completely abandoned and covered in a dark obstructive fog. The only things filling the cityscape were hostile monsters. They were not very helpful. The bard felt really lucky when he spotted someone running across the rooftops. He didn't know where they were running or what they were running from, but he could just help them if there was any problem. That was if they dared to voice an objection, after his friendly greetings. What's more, the person was quite nice to look at. Pale subtle skin, fiery red hair, a pair of kinky fangs. Oh, she was a vampire. That explained her good looks. Although she was obviously a vampire, judging from the way she moved previously and looked, there was a big difference to the vampires he met previously. Meeting her face to face like this, he could feel an almost noble and pure aura from her. It was completely different from a trash like Valen Willis he had met in Delta. The weapon in her hand also caught his interest. It was a glaive, and it was another weapon that was unable to be appraised by system skills. Despite a lack of system support, the blacksmith was able to see that his was a powerful weapon, maybe even comparable to his giant's meteor rod. Talking to her, he realized that he was indeed lucky, to find someone that had even seen their flying school bus and could tell him the right direction. He was just about to get back on Puffles when he heard the commotion behind him. Genevieve, he heard from the edge of the roof. It seemed whatever the lady ran from, had caught up because of him. It was a handsome man with the same diabolical charisma as the vampire lady. You also seem to be in need of a little help, he asked her because he felt a little bad for delaying her. Puffles behind him rammed his sharp claw-like insect legs into the wall of the building and stopped floating. It was just a waste of mana. The new vampire was adequately shocked at the sight of Puffles and seemed to be lost for words. For a moment Seth felt tempted to say something along the lines of, "Don't you see that the lady does not want to speak with you? You shouldn't be so pushy," but it felt a little too cliché, even for Seth. He doesn't seem to be interested in a fight, Puffles commented about the man standing on the roof. Yet, although they definitely fought before. Maybe I should help them open up about their problems, he mused. Despite all of their surface wounds already being healed, it was quite obvious that they fought from the blood and sign of battle on their clothes. But this guy didn't have any killing intent when he arrived first. At the moment he was too wary to move, anyway. Puffles' presence brought silence to the rooftop. Since Seth now knew that his friends were probably in safety in that funny-looking barrier, he felt a little more relaxed. You two seem to have something to talk about. How about I, and Puffles here, play the mediator and make sure nobody kills the other prematurely, the blacksmith suggested. The vampire looked at him in confusion, as if this was the first time he noticed him. The vampiress looked at him in disbelief. It seemed that talking with her pursuer was her least preferred option. After his shock, the vampires now seemed to have calmed down. He looked back and forth between the lady and Seth. Seeing her not run away, he gave the blacksmith a thankful nod. Genevieve, the dude started off calmly but was immediately interrupted. The whole city was suddenly bathed in a bright light that momentarily blinded all of them. When the world regained contours, Seth's jaw fell open. Where just now had been the city of Sigma, was now a giant crater. It was an irregular hole in the cityscape and had cut out even the deepest levels of the subterranean city parts. At Seth's command, Puffles erected a golden shield around the rooftop the three were standing on. Its function was not protective, but to keep these two from running away. I guess, now we really have something to talk about, he said coldly. The fact that the funny barrier where his friends had entered, had vanished together with the biggest part of the city center, meaning that fun and jiggles were over. These two were the only ones that probably had an inkling of what was going on, and he was ready to beat it out of them. Of the two he talked to, only the vampiress seemed to hear what he was saying. She had been surprised and shocked at first, but became anxious and panicky when she heard him talk without an ounce of his previous friendliness. The vampire on the other hand seemed to be caught in a state of shock, unable to realize what had even just happened or hear his words. His reaction made it pretty clear, that he probably knew what had just happened, but his state made him useless. Her reaction meant that she probably knew a little more than him. She twitched when a silver sword suddenly appeared in front of her. Seth had brought out the sanguine silver sword and pointed at her threateningly. "Tell me what you know, Genevieve." The bard spat out the name he heard from the vampire before. She looked at him and then at the giant eye visor hanging at the building. The vampiress was not afraid of the blacksmith but had a lot of respect for the nightmarish centipede monster he rode. On cue, Puffles bent forward and hissed in her face, showing her the last sight Puffles' victim saw if he ate them. They were transported to the beyond. It was the vampire who suddenly spoke up with a solemn voice. "You lured me away. I know that you hate me, Genevieve. But these people were innocent. My family was innocent." He didn't become angry, he simply broke down at the edge of the roof, crying. Sorrow, reproach, and a glimmer of betrayal flickered across her face. "We were also innocent when you abandoned us, but for whatever it's worth, I didn't know they planned this," she whispered with clenched fists. Seth ignored their drama and extracted the important information. The Beyond, like in the 24th Ethnarch of the Beyond, he made the connection. "How do you know that title?" both vampires exclaimed surprised. Seth lowered his sword. It didn't work to intimidate her and his arm was getting tired. "Oh, now you are talking to me? I killed a thing calling itself like that 2 days ago. It was also the reason I got separated from my friends, that just got pulled into whatever just happened," he revealed. "You killed it," the vampire exclaimed. "You are the one who killed it," Genevieve exclaimed. "He really killed one?" the vampire asked the lady. "Great. Since I have your attention, how about one of you explains to me the current situation to me, so we can look for a solution?" "A solution? Of course. My gut and my party list tell me that my friends aren't dead. There obviously has to be a way to bring them back. So, start talking already." Seeing the blacksmith's optimism, the vampire finally calmed down and thought for a moment. "You are right, there might be a way," he suddenly said. With a clear head, he finally introduced himself as Vlad Pierce, one of the leaders of Sigma's survivors. Genevieve kept her mouth shut and Vlad didn't go into the detail about their past, but he explained the current situation. The Beyond was an empty space ruled by terrifying beings, similar to the creature Seth had faced. Its boundaries were very unstable, which caused it to often create unstable connections with other worlds. This allowed these creatures to invade and kidnap beings from these worlds to their realm, to rule and torture them until they become deformed versions of their former selves, or worst of all, become like their tormentors. "So, you are saying, because they couldn't get through your defense, they just took the whole thing and part of the city back to their world? Then how do we bring them back?" Chapter 542. Idyll and Mo. Sigma, the wards. They were currently seated in a modern meeting room, together with Captain Heasing, some of his subordinates, and other leading members of the wards. As a representative from Delta, she was a very important guest and this conversation was crucial, especially in the current emergency situation. While they were waiting for someone to get Cade, Heasing explained their current situation since their leader and people were currently fighting another siege attack. This was not a big worry on the captain's mind. The wards had already managed to resist these invaders for almost 2 months now. It was mostly thanks to their leader and his magic knowledge that far surpassed anyone's in Sigma. Their safety was not a problem, for now, a lot dire was their food and water situation. Heasing explained about what happened in Sigma. How one day these creatures that came from the beyond appeared together with their weird structures that endlessly spawned beasts. Sigma had managed to deal with the waves at first, but it had been a losing battle. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't clear these towers of trial as the beasts called them. They just kept losing their best players. Since they didn't even gain experience fighting these beasts, they could only grow weaker. In the end, it was their current leader, a vampire called Vlad Pierce, who gave them a little hope for survival by erecting the wards, but things were not looking rosy now. Survival didn't mean victory. The surrounding city was constantly getting more dangerous. Teams sent out to scavenge for food would more and more often return empty-handed or not at all. The few safe spots they had in the city also started being overrun lately. As they tried to survive, they just kept losing people. At the moment it looked like they had exchanged a quick death for a slow one. Lena easily understood that being contacted by another district in this kind of situation was like sending charcoal in the snowy weather. But the princess had a suspicion that he didn't tell her everything. We saw signs of magic along the houses and street on our way here. Were these safe houses? She asked, fully knowing that they were not. She wanted him to tell her the truth. Heesing made a complicated face before giving up with a sigh. This man was definitely not made for these kinds of talks. You are right. We didn't just lose safe houses. The wards was once a lot bigger than it is now. The constant attacks over the past months have forced the leader to shrink the safe zone constantly. We lack the energy supply to face the increasingly stronger attack over such a wide area, he explained. They didn't just lack supplies, there was also no guarantee that their defenses would hold out. He had prepared for a possible situation like this and was musing on what exact actions to take when someone entered the room. Cade. Lena called out when the Rakshasa girl finally entered. The princess actually felt a big weight fall off her back. She had known all the people she sent north to investigate, and it had hit her hard to find out that they were all dead. Seeing at least one survive and being able to bring her back home was a huge relief, even if it didn't help with the guilt. Princess, Cade answered with a calm smile. It was Cade's turn to speak about her experience when coming to Sigma and what happened to the others. During her story, Heesing's face lit up, darkened, and grimaced in confusion and surprise a few times. Some details were even new to him, such as the destruction of communication devices and the space lock that surrounded Sigma and made players unable to use home call to return to other districts. His face darkened when he heard that people even stronger than Cade couldn't resist the powers acting in their district, and it became even darker when he heard about the girl she saved and the girl's story. The monastery had been one of the last safe houses and one of the few places that researched the werewolf curse, as they called the most numerous hairy beasts that propagated by infecting others. Many of these monsters had once been citizens of Sigma. Now they were the bulk of the enemy forces. My lady, I can feel spatial fissures being generated in the vicinity. The hooded figure that had been standing behind her suddenly leaned forward to whisper in her ears. What should we do? The princess asked him, alarmed. We have to evacuate as quickly as possible. We don't have much time, if any. Everyone was surprised by the hooded figure's sudden words. However, they quickly realized that his warning was true, and it came a little too late. As if on cue, the sky outside the dome suddenly darkened. As if someone flipped the light switch, the dim daylight was gone and only the flickering electric lights fought off the darkness in the room. It's too late, the figure commented, disappointed. He was audible that he blamed himself for noticing too late. We have been transported to a different plane, he explained. Lena patted his shoulder to cheer him up. It's not your fault, don't feel down. We will need your help more than ever now. Your Highness, who is that person? Cade asked the question everyone had on their mind. At Lena's cue, the figure lowered his hood and exposed a wizened face framed by snow-white hair. A magnificent beard also fell out from his collar. The hooded figure exposed himself as the picture book example of a powerful old wizard. This is Dylan Mo, a master enchanter and expert in spatial magic. Lena introduced him to them. He was the trump card of the princess. She had learned from Seth's idea. After her last experience with arduously shepherding refugees across this vast continent, she had asked for one of Krina's spatial masters to accompany her in case they needed a quick extraction or to open a portal for a large number of people. So what if someone phased them into another world? This was child's play to the Krina Empire. They transported people and cities to other worlds on a daily basis. As one of the Empire's experts, she was confident he would be able to solve the problem. Mr. Mo, can you explain what happened? She asked him for an explanation, now that his identity was revealed. Of course. After a cursory observation of the energy signature and the change in spatial properties, the method that was used to bring us here was a rather crude and natural one. It seems to be reliant on the positioning and weak boundary of the caster's own dimension. This was a cursory observation, was what everyone's gaze, except Lena's, said when the enchanter finished. And that means, the princess asked for a simpler explanation. As long as we solve the issue of the space lock in this place, I could easily open a portal directly back to Delta. Thanks to this dimension's current properties, it would take only a third of the energy than usual to maintain a connection, he explained. Then all we have to do is to get rid of this space lock, Heesing exclaimed hopefully. Easier said than done. We are now in enemy territory and I am afraid that the space lock depends on these towers of trial you mentioned. They are also the source of the spell that brought us here. The wizard shot down the captain's hopes. It was clear from his story, that they had no hope of destroying the towers, even when they were still in Sigma. Now they were in the beyond. There was no way things would become easier on enemy turf. Don't worry too much. I'm sure we can do this if we pool our forces. We have Cade, Yvette, Dylan, and in the shuttle on the roof is another Leave 70+ party waiting. Lena tried to cheer him up. She was confident in the people she had brought along. Although she was asking them to get into life-threatening situations quite often lately, the princess was sure they would agree. There was no their way back home, after all. Lena only hoped Seth wouldn't be too angry at her. She was clear about the fact, that they were only in this because of her urging to find Cade quickly. There was no telling whether they would have gotten into this situation if they waited for Seth, but even if they did end up here again. The princess had to admit, that she would feel more secure if the blacksmith was with them now. You are underestimating Sigma. We even had several Leave 70+ parties try and raid the towers, but none of them came back. Heesing argued. Well, were they fully decked out in epic equipment? Lena countered smugly. And not fully, no. And we have Dylan, who is more than apt to deal with this situation. She couldn't talk about what the space magician's power to them, but tried to frame it. I hope you understand, even if you are that confident in your team, we have to organize ourselves first before we can give you an answer. Of course, Lena understood this. With how the situation had suddenly changed, Sigma would need some time to adapt. She also needed to talk with Yule Katzfer and explain the situation. She doubted they would not work with her, as this seemed like their only chance to return home. Chapter 543. Vampire Territory. Genevieve, you must know one of the ways that lead to the beyond. The vampire pressed his sister. This was his solution. Although the Ethnarchs had used the Towers of Trial as stable portals and to transport a part of the city to the beyond, it didn't mean this was the only way. The boundaries of the beyond were unstable and constantly shifting, this meant it would constantly open new paths. According to Vlad, she was the only vampire aside from him in Sigma. He concluded that she didn't come through the towers, but through a path that connected with the vampire's land in the beyond. They would be able to enter the beyond that way, then they would just have to find where the wards had been transported to. But they had to hurry. According to Vlad, the defenses he had set up would not be able to resist. Not when the miasma and hordes of the beyond directly attacked them. You got quite the fantasy, brother. You think you could lead all of them out of the beyond just like that? If you had that power, why did you leave in the first place? She asked sarcastically. The vampire didn't admit it, but he also couldn't deny it. His conflicted expression showed that this was an uncomfortable truth. Let me guess, you are only planning to get your family and run. Just like back then, when you just ran off alone, she spat out. I left to protect you. All of them, he finally exploded. Protect us? How arrogant can you be? We were ready to die with you for our freedom, she cried, tears flooding her face. That's the problem. I didn't wish for you, any of you, to die. I'm at a deal with them, and death in one last fight would have been better than the fate you condemned us to. You have no idea. And she kept on whining about the terrible fate the surviving vampires had to suffer through after their leader was gone. How they tried to keep fighting but lost all battles until they finally ended up in slavery and servitude. Seth understood how much this brother and sister duo needed to talk things out, so he patiently waited. Stop whining already. Everyone gets it. He was a leader who couldn't shoulder his incompetence and the death of his people, and you blame him for being a faulty human vampire, whatever. Can we jump to the point where both of you realize that you made mistakes and move on? My friends are stuck in this she*whole dimension. Tell me how to get there. Now. Seth had instinctively used voice of Seth and fueled it with all his aggravation. Genevieve barely managed to resist and instead started to argue with the blacksmith. I already said it. There is nothing you can do. Fitting like a glove, the Wraithguard blatantly took its rightful place in the middle of her perfect face, punching her across the roof where she hit the reinforced concrete railing. It was the first time Seth actively and directly used the status improvements granted to him by the divine soul armaments he made. This girl had been looking down on him from the very start as if he was just a sidekick to Puffles. Which was fair if he compared his own power to that of Puffles. But even he was, the power of the Eye-Visor's sidekick was nothing to scoff at. You won't tell me what I can and can't. He slowly walked toward over and candidly picked up the glaive she had unconsciously let go of. The blacksmith proceeded to put it in his inventory. This is confiscated, he said to her, who was groaning on the ground. The only thing I want to hear from you is the location of that entrance your brother mentioned. She suddenly shot up, her claw aiming for his face. However, it stopped several centimeters before touching it. No, it was stopped. Seth had caught her wrist with an iron grip, provoking a shocked expression from the vampires. The blacksmith didn't know their level, as Genevieve was not part of the system and Vlad's level was too high for his observation. But he was obviously able to compete with them when it came to stats alone. Genevieve, please tell us, Vlad pleaded. Fine. Let go of me, she barked and pulled her hand out of the blacksmith's grip. You want to run into your death and despair. That actually works out for me. I will show you. Follow me. She finally agreed and led the vampire and the blacksmith towards the outskirts of the city. She walked through dark alleys, left, right, left. Seth already suspected she was just wasting time and aimlessly walking around, but the environment started to change. Their surroundings grew darker and darker until they were finally walking through a pitch-black void. The two men could just make out the back of their guide for a few long moments before the surroundings finally started to brighten again. It brightened, but it was still a darkness that was hard for the eyes to penetrate. Even Seth's night vision didn't help a lot in this place. In the front appeared an exit and outside was twilight. Leaving through the exit and looking back, Seth found that they had just left a cave. Behind them was a rocky hill, barely a small mountain, before them lay a dead, desolate land covered in grey dust and desiccated black shrubbery. Beside him, he saw Vlad's face fall in terror. The vampire didn't say anything, but the sight seemed to hit him hard. Don't look so shocked. This is the kind of place you condemned us to survive in. Genevieve scoffed at her brother in disdain. Hey, get a grip. Do you have any idea where it put Sigma? Seth asked, a little annoyed. He couldn't help but be annoyed by their drama. Mina and the others were in danger and they were wasting precious time. He had already tested the cloak of Hecate. I worked, but the direction was vague and a little hard to read. It should in the territory of the Shaggy Men, the sister answered with a grin that exposed her fang. Vlad cursed silently to the side before explaining. When the Beyond swallowed a piece of land, it would slowly corrode away the ground and its people. While the earth turned into the grey dust of the Beyond as its life was sapped out, the people would be slowly twisted over time and become a multitude of abominable creatures, like Seth had seen in Sigma. The Shaggy Men were the most common creatures of the Beyond and often the only thing that was left of previous victims. The Shaggy Men could easily infect weaker beings with a low resistance to grow their numbers, and they lived in the empty dunes between the crumbling lands. It all sounded very poetic for saying, they put it somewhere in the empty place wherever was space for it. Genevieve led the way. Although the blacksmith did not trust her, her path coincided with the directions of his cloak and his gut feeling, which was why he decided to follow for now. Genevieve, are you leading us to? It's coincidentally on the way. Seth could roughly guess what this was about and his suspicions were quickly confirmed a while later. A ramshackle settlement soon came into view. The buildings looked crooked, old, and worn. It was like a ghost town, but there were people present. They were not much more than skin and bones, their deep-set eyes without any glimmer of life or hope. Wearing rags of what could have been noble gown at one time and broken weapons Seth recognized as a scrap of once fine products, they were a pitiful sight to behold. This is what you did to our people, Vlad. Chapter 544. The Beyond. The Beyond, Sigma. So you are telling us we were transported to a place outside of the system and have to clear several dungeons to get back? All before these faltering defenses give out. Mike summed up what Lena had just told them. Is that really the only way? Mina asked, unsure of what to think. I am afraid it is. Dylan, who had revealed his identity to the party, answered her question solemnly. I'm sure that the people of Sigma will also join us, Lena added confidently. Unfortunately, we have no troops to spare, Heesing revealed to them with a dire expression. The past few hours had been a hectic nightmare for Heesing and his peers. Only a few of their defenders managed to return and their leader had vanished. Vlad was nowhere to be found, and the people that managed to drag themselves back into the wards also had no idea where he had gone. To make matters worse, the hordes of macabre monsters outside had swollen on and were pressing against the barrier with unprecedented force. They would need every able man to defend, or their defenses may break long before they even started clearing the towers. If we abandon our people in the process of opening an escape route, it would put the cart before the horse, he explained apologetically. It became quite clear that Lena and the others from Delta were Sigma's only hope to survive this situation. It was already a stretch to expect Sigma's people to be able to continue defending while they were out to get rid of the space lock. This will be a race against time then, Mike said seriously. Their party, Cade, Yvette, and Dylan were the only free-fighting force available currently. Well, I have some good news. First of all, after a more thorough analysis, I can inform you that we won't have to destroy all of them. Half will be enough to create a teleport formation connecting to Delta. The space mage gave them some good news for a change. Under the current conditions, it was unlikely they could destroy all towers and return the whole city back. It was easier to just destroy enough to open the space lock and evacuate the people back to Earth. How many are half? Finn asked. There are 24 towers in total, so 12 will suffice, Dylan answered her question readily. That's still a lot. Didn't you say that Sigma failed, despite sending several parties to clear them? Mike asked doubtfully. Even if they only had to take on half, if they had a hard time clearing just one, how would they do 12? That's the other piece of news I have. Those things are not dungeons. They are not protected by the god of dungeons. So we don't have to abide by dungeon rules. Finn asked excitedly. Dungeon rules were what they called the simple differences that made the structures ruled by the god of dungeons different from ordinary ones. First of all, they were indestructible. Adventurers couldn't dig through their walls or floors unless explicitly allowed. There were others, like dungeons having specific conditions to be cleared and more. But the most important one at this point was the skipping of floors. One couldn't just fly up on a dungeon tower and enter through a window on a higher floor. They might die on the spot or just be kicked out of the dungeons if they are lucky. Since these rules don't count for these towers of trial, we can simply jump to the core room that powers these structure and destroy it, without fighting through the hordes of monsters on the other floors. The space mage revealed his finding. Obviously, it wasn't that the people of Sigma had not tried entering from somewhere else on the tower, but they simply did not manage to get through the defenses. Since they had a space mage, things would be different. But didn't you say that the space here was locked? Mina threw in. It is, but only to keep people from escaping. It is way too crude a magic to stop me from using my skills locally, the wizard answered with a friendly laugh. After revealing this information, the group came up with a simple plan to conquer the towers. Dylan would teleport them inside. Yulkat's fur would fight whatever guardian would be protecting the structure's core, while Cade, Yvette, and Dylan would destroy the facility. The Beyond, Vampire Land. Although Seth felt driven and wanted to act like he didn't care, so he could go look for his friends, the blacksmith couldn't. The sight of misery before him had stopped him. As much as he would have liked to be, he wasn't heartless. When it was just the two siblings bickering, it was just a stupid story and drama to him. Facing the people actually suffering made it a completely different matter. If that is what this place is doing to you, why aren't you just running away? Seth stated the most obvious question. A mere few hours away from here was an entrance to another world. Although he felt conflicted about inviting a clan of vampires to his home world, this should have been the easiest solution for them. Genevieve herself had been to Sigma without a problem. Vlad's face fell the moment he stated the question, and his sister scoffed at him. Don't worry, I tell him. We can't run, thanks to my good brother here. As the leader, he made a binding oath in our name, she said. The leader is to be exiled. In exchange, the vampires will not be actively eradicated, but can't leave the Beyond without permission, she said, his voice seething with sarcasm. No matter how much we fought, we are bound to this oath he made in our name. Condemned to suffer and slowly waste away in this place, she added solemnly with a bitter expression. Although she had seemed to say it to hurt Vlad in the beginning, in the end, it had hurt her just as much. Seth's ears pricked up and his gaze wandered over the miserable vampires with a new glint. Wouldn't it be a waste if he didn't help them? In the meantime, Vlad had sunken to his knees. He was left in disbelief about the consequences of his past decisions. Suddenly, the blacksmith's rough hand suddenly grabbed the back of his collar and pulled him back to his feet. A loud jubilant voice penetrated the ruins of the settlement, piercing everyone's ears with an annoying volume. Here yet, Vlad had returned with help to liberate you from the burden of your oppressors. The bard's voice was loud and reached every nook and cranny of the settlement. At his side both, Vlad and Genevieve looked at him in shock and confusion. Vlad. Leader. Vlad. Master Vlad, voices could be heard as desiccated bodies crawled out from the alleys and doors. Some were too weak to walk, others were barely shambling around. It was like a scene from a horror movie. However, Seth looked at it with satisfaction. And a little worry. He had to admit that a horde of starved vampires looked a little more intimidating than he expected. Their voices were also not exactly the happiest when repeating the name of their beloved leader. To be completely honest, their voices and groans became filled with anger when their crusty eyes fell on Vlad standing in the middle of the road. Kook, did you really think anybody would be happy to see him? Genevieve laughed at the side. Maybe his idea would be a little harder than expected. Chapter 545. Propaganda makes the dream work. Boy, how could you do this to us? A wizened voice asked. Why did you abandon us, leader? A man wearing the scraps of a uniform mumbled. Their wails tortured the vampire who was held up solely by the blacksmith's strong hands grabbing his collar. All I need from you is not get in my way and everyone will get a happy end, the bard whispered at Genevieve to the side. She huffed but actually did not try to pick a fight with him. The skald on the other hand started reciting to the crowd in a poetic way. He spoke with an easy, calming rhythm that hid the power of voice of Seth swinging along with it. I may not know what you were told, but listen to me and put your grievances on hold. The bard also started using channeling. Although Seth had never really tried using it without having a finished piece, he knew that it was possible. It was one of the privileges of a skald, to even empower his ordinary speeches this way. Of course, the power came down to his stats and the demon that decided to lend a hand. If he was lucky it could be someone like Fornews or Ronwi who were known for speechcraft. The former even had the power to enchant allies and enemies alike with his speeches. That was if he was lucky. However, Seth did not only bet on his luck this time, even when he had the lucky trinket ring. Using soul trade he specifically aimed for Ronwi, mostly because he was well known for his greater greed for souls. These creatures were all not part of the system and far outclassed his level. So he was rather safe than sorry. At the price of 30 small souls, inspiration started to flood into his mind and Seth started painting the people a picture of a hero. Vlad, their leader, who had suffered for years in foreign lands to find a power that could help them. Despite knowing and worrying about the great burden he had put on them, his people, he had forced himself to venture out and brave storm and hail to find help for them all. Obviously, this was all hogwash. Absolute nonsense, but the people swallowed it. Not because it was credible, but because this was what they wanted to hear and believe. His words, his voice, and his over 300 points in personality sold them the fairy tale they wanted as truth. Tears of emotion started streaming from the deep-set eyes and down their hollow cheeks. He could even see Genevieve's face, a person who knew the truth, soften in sorrow for the tragic hero's journey. He told them how he found him, Seth, and his friends and that they already managed to easily dispatch the dastardly 24th Ethnarch on their journey. In the end, our enemy, your tormentors managed to lure us into a trap just before we could enter the beyond. They have entrapped our army in a formation and transported them to the beyond to grind them up. So I beseech thee, brave vampires, join us in our quest to ambush the perpetrators and take back the freedom of all of us. Could they help? Did it make sense for the saviors to need the help of these weakened and starving people they came to save? No, it didn't from an objective standpoint. However, facts and logic were long gone from the mob. This riled-up crowd was trapped in the throes of demonic speechcraft. They were ready to don their ripped armor and raise their broken weapon, for one last charge at the side of their tragic hero. Damn, had I known what kind of effect I can buy for just 30 souls, I would have used this a lot more often. Seth thought to himself silently, after he finally ended his speech. Looking into the black staring face of Vlad, Seth started to worry whether the tragic hero himself started believing Seth's baloney. Hey, Vlad, get your shit together. I need you to play along with this. Can we do something about their circumstances? Are you like vampires in fiction that instantly recover when they get some blood in their bellies? The blacksmith asked Vlad once the vampire's mind found back to the present. It's not instantly, but as long you feed them enough blood, they should recover quickly, he answered slowly. Will a bunch of almost fresh monster bodies do? He asked. He didn't have too much on him currently, but there were still a few dozen lizardmen corpses and similar stuff in the storage of the golem forge. Although their levels were rather high, they had no materials that made them worth more than being turned into meat golems at some point. Now they found a secondary purpose. Brave warriors, you have suffered a lot. Although our main force is trapped, we still have managed to secure some resources. Please strengthen and equip yourself before we march into battle, he called out at Vlad's nod. It wasn't only several monster corpses that appeared but also several heaps of equipment. Similar to the corpses, these were the low-grade dungeon drops he had stored in the golem forge for a later refinement into funny golems. Looking at their scrap weapons, ripped clothes, and useless armor, even these Japtems were better than their current condition. What the heck are you two doing? Genevieve had finally escaped the haze of fantasy Seth's speech had cast even on her and spoke up. What do you mean? Isn't it obvious that I am recruiting and providing for an army? The blacksmith asked back. We are done for if the 13th Ethnarch finds out. Even if I and Vlad fight, we can't wind against it. You are leading them to their deaths, she aggressively whispered. Well, isn't that what you wanted? Have your people die in one last rebellious fight. That was what you asked of Vlad, didn't you? So whether we managed to get to Sigma or you get wiped out on the way, it's a happy end for everyone, he mocked her. Of course, I would prefer whoever Vlad made that oath with and bring everyone out of here. Don't you think that will be a much nicer ending, he continued. You? Killing the 13th Ethnarch, she exclaimed. I mean, I won't stop you two from helping, but sure I will give it a try. Is it a lot stronger than the 24th? He asked on the side as he made Vlad direct people to get their corpses aka blood packs and equipment from the piles he had made on the city street. It's a lot stronger. How did you even manage to kill the 24th? Even if we fought an arduous battle and gained victory at the cost of many losses, they would always return. She mumbled. Oh, yeah. This kind of enemy is really hard to beat if you can't take away their souls. That's how I killed it, I stole its soul. You have to be kidding me. No, for real cease. I swear, Seth said with a chuckle. That was why Seth was not worried at all about these Ethnarchs. Even when they were stronger than the 24th, the spirit blacksmith had quite a few ways to mess with their souls. And for the worst case scenario, he had the helm of Hades, which was why he excluded himself from being wiped out if they met one. This had finally robbed Genevieve of her words and Seth could concentrate on watching his new strike force equip themselves. Just like Vlad had said, the recovery was not an immediate swelling of muscles and smoothing of the skin, but it still happened quite quickly. An hour later, before everyone had even gotten their new equipment, the community of vampires that was left in the settlement started looking like very healthy young people, indistinguishable from Genevieve or Vlad. The only funny thing about them was the equipment. With everyone wearing things of different sets with different colors and styles, they looked like a tin can army that just emerged from a dumpster. However, Stats over looks was a pearl of old wisdom he kept repeating to the vampires over and over. Reality did not have the option to transmogrify equipment, yet. 2 hours after their arrival a ragtag army of 500 battle-ready vampires had assembled. Although only 200 of them were actually warriors, the rest were technically non-combatants. Since they were too riled up to let themselves be left behind, and it was better to take them along anyway, they also wore those trashy items for self-defense. The blacksmith stepped toward Genevieve who had kept silent while he and Vlad readied the people. Have you decided? Do you want to come along and fight alongside your people? He asked her. Since she was the second strongest vampire aside from Vlad, it would have been reassuring to have her fight for him. Okay. Let me see what happy end you can bring us, she gave in. As an act of trust, Seth gave her a glaive. Not her glaive though, he didn't trust her that much, but one he had made. Chapter 546 Tower of Trial. After briefing their plans with Heesings and the current leaders of the survivors, the teams from Delta set off using the armored bus. They were lucky that there did not seem to be any airborne monsters in the beyond, this meant they had the air supremacy. Which was better for them. In the dim twilight of the beyond they could not see the streets anymore, as they were covered in a roving mass of monsters. Like a sea of bodies and limbs, they surged against the barrier of the wards. We should hurry, Mina muttered at the sight. With the number of beasts steadily growing, they might have less time than they thought. Heesing had given them a map of Sigma with the locations of the towers marked on it. Using this they had come up with an order to destroy the 12 nearest towers. It didn't take long for them to reach the first location, but the tower was not immediately obvious. Is it the small one over there? Finn asked, squinting her tiny eyes to see through the dark mist. Yes, that should be it, Dylan affirmed it. The fairy had spotted the small tower in the shadow among the modern high-rises. As mystical and magical as this structure of terror was, it was simply dwarfed by Earth's megalomaniacal architecture. "Let's hope not all of them are hidden like this," Bulko commented as the shuttle landed on a neighboring building. The crude spire the people of Sigma called Tower of Trials resembled a rock spire with a big gaping entrance and many irregular windows spread across the surface. After Dylan made a few movements as if casting a spell, he spoke up. "Okay, I found the location of this tower's core. You guys should get ready while I prepare the teleport formation." While Yulkatsfur, Yvette, and Cade checked their equipment, the magician started drawing a magic circle on the rooftop. With this, he would transfer the assault team directly into the core room of the spire. Once everything was ready, Mike, Mina, and the others stepped into the circle. With a flash of bright light, they vanished. Dylan would stay on the roof and keep the teleport ready to extract them once they were finished inside and to protect the shuttle. The party appeared in a dark hall, dimly illuminated by grotesque fat bugs that gave off a sickly orange light. Their light did not go far in the thick black mist that filled the room and enveloped anything past an arm's length from them in darkness. Mina cursed as it was not only night vision that failed her, but all of the darkness did not count as true shadows. Her use of darkness as a shadow mage and shadow assassin was limited in this place. "If it's like this, it's better to expose our position than to face our enemy blindly," Mike stated with a sight. Yvette, Finn, and Bulko all cast a light spell to illuminate the core room. Balls of magic traveled high in the air and a hick holy light managed to penetrate the black mist to some degree. Finally able to see the room they had entered, they wished they could have stayed in blissful ignorance. The circular room had walls of melded together bodies, covered in deeply unsettling carvings. On one hand, was the entrance, a hole leading into darkness, on the other, stood a giant. Not the nice kind of giant Seth had talked about meeting during his journey. Not even the terrible kind of mountain giant he also talked about. This was a massive being, easily 20 meters tall, with the tar-like skin covered in boils and warts. The deformed creature looked at them with 3 wrathful eyes of different sizes. With a huff of the creature the room filled with an indescribably disgusting stench. Mina's eyes teared up and she was close to throwing up. It was especially hard on the beastmen with their fine noses. In the back, she could hear Lixus and Yvette coughing, while Mike groaned similar to herself. "Get in formation," they heard Mike's voice. Yulkatsfur instinctively got in their positions while Yvette and Cade joined them with some delay. Mike, Finn, and Cade were in the front, while Lixus, Yvette, and Bulko got some distance from the giant. Mina would wait for an opportunity to strike the beast from its blind spot. They had just started moving when the thing started moving. With unprecedented speed it lashed out at the 3 in the front, forcing them to evade. A wave of black sludge splattered in all directions, almost hitting Mike, if not for the quick acting of Bulko who gave him a magic shield. The massive priest also summoned a giant turtle monster with a bear head to act as the party's temporary tank to bolster the front row, while Cade's Jin joined the back row to add more damage. Charging forward after forcing the front row apart, a wave of fireballs forced the sludge monster to stumble back again by a few steps. In the back stood Lixus, who had just finished a double cast, with 2 spirits to her left and right. One was a medium-tier fire elemental and the other a low-tier wind elemental. She had managed to contract them after growing her secondary class as an elven elementalist. One could mirror her spells while the other could strengthen the damage of fire and wind element magic. In the fire, the black diseased-looking skin became dried out and crusty. Similarly, when Mike used this chance to slash the creature's back with his flaming sword, covering it in a column of fire, it also became a dull hardened crust. Cade on the other hand used her claws to send several volleys of energy blades, mangling the other leg. Despite looking promising, the mangled parts simply melded back together again. At that moment a pale grey circle appeared around the beast, almost completely halting its movements. Yvette had finished casting her holy magic, catching the sludge beast in a stasis spell. "Melee fighters, concentrate on destroying the walls. These signs should be the core of the space formation. The beast is just a guardian," the sane Tess called out. "Okay, but some of the casters should keep firing at the beast. Fire magic seems to work on it." Mike gave back a set of instructions. While Finn, Cade, Mina, and Mike started demolishing the embodiment of bad taste that was the walls, Lixus and the Jinn started enveloping the motionless beast in a whirling storm of fire. After holding the beast in place for almost 30 seconds, Yvette's magic finally lost its light, revealing a grey burnt statue of the sludge beast. About a third of the walls had lost their light when the melee fighters stopped warily to look at the beast. None of them believed that it would be this easy. And they were proven right. Black cracks appeared on the grey shell and everyone was covered in a golden barrier mere moments before the shell exploded outward, covering them in a hailstorm of debris and dust. Mina, the high-pitched voice cried out. From the dust cloud in the darkness, the beast, now smaller and faster, had appeared beside Mina and Finn. Its still giant fist was already aiming for the beast woman's head. The golden shattered like glass and the shadow assassin had just enough time to lift her arms to block the attack. She was hit hard and her slender frame was smashed into the wall. No. The rest of the party could not see what was going on past the dust cloud across the room. But they heard her high-pitched cry as it warped in grief and became a deep, bone-shaking growl. Suddenly, a black muddy figure shot out of the dust cloud and smashed into the opposite wall, several meters above the ground. Like an ink splatter, it started to slowly slide down the wall. Accompanied by 3 massive frost moths, another giant figure charged after it. 15-meter tall and with the bulky physique of a dwarf, the boulder-like fists started massaging the guardian into the wall. Like a steam hammer, the quick consecutive hits fueled by rage didn't allow their victim to react or move. Every third or fourth hit a bunch of giant moths spawned that also sieged the sludge beast. The frost moths froze it and the fist broke it apart, over and over. Bits and pieces kept flying everywhere. Following Finn's sorrowful cry, accompanied by the drumming of fists, Bulko charged into the dust cloud. He registered that her situation was bad and he could only save her directly. He found Mina lying on the ground. Her arms, ribs, and some other bones were broken. Her inner organs also suffered heavy damage. Fortunately, she was enveloped by the light of a healing spell that was slowly mending her injuries and preserved her life so far. The massive priest hurriedly kneeled down beside her, prepared several ingredients, and got ready to cast his strongest healing spells on Mina. Knowing that just healing was not enough, he also began to use one of his special skills as a mirror cleric. Her ability to transfer her injuries to himself. With his massive endurance and part troll lineage, he was able to manage this degree of injuries a lot better than the frail assassin. Feeling his own organs rupture and bones crack, he calmed down when he saw Mina's face relax. He transferred roughly half her injuries onto himself, before proceeding to heal her and himself to the point that they were not in danger. In the meantime, he had no capacity to care for the ongoing battle. The priest trusted his comrades to take care of it. And when the dust settled, and Bulko looked up, the guardian and the giant that had attacked it were gone. Mike and the others approached him with a worried look. "How is she?" her brother asked. "She will make it. I just finished treating her," the priest answered tiredly. The relief on everyone's faces was visible, but someone was missing. "Can I trouble you to look after her, while we finish off the room?" the party leader asked. Showing his hand, there was an unconscious Finn sleeping on his palm. She looked sick and a little haggard. "What happened?" the priest asked surprised. "She is the one that beat the guardian," Mike answered a little unsure. "How?" Bulko exclaimed. "I think that is something she will have to explain." Chapter 547. Another lullaby. With the troop of vampires in tow, Seth quickly reached the edge of the vampire land. The difference wasn't big. Looking down from the cliff that separated the vampire's land from the rest of the beyond like an island in the sea, he saw a dark desert of grey dust. If it wasn't for the black pieces of shrubbery that bore witness to some previous existence of life, the vampire's land was no different from this desert anymore. This desert was what their land would also turn into at some point, the land of the beyond, where the twisted remnants of previous victims would wander aimlessly. "Genevieve, you lead the way," Seth instructed. While the blacksmith rode off the back of Puffles, the vampires ran along, keeping up with the Iviser's speed. Even with the huge crowd of over 500 people, they were not slowed down. Although the situation was dire, Seth had to admit that this would have been almost cool, if they didn't look like a clown troupe with all these mostly mismatched and colorful armor pieces. "We are soon entering the territory of the Shaggy people," the vampiress called out from the front. The blacksmith had no idea how she knew this, as he couldn't see any kind of landmarks. But he also didn't bother to think much about it. He periodically kept checking their direction with his cloak to make sure she wasn't leading them in the wrong direction. On the way, they had not met any kind of creature, but after crossing the invisible border more scattered creatures appeared in the vicinity. The strength varied a lot, but none could compete with the freshly fed vampires. Since they easily dispatched them, the blacksmith left it to vampires to clean their path at first. However, as they kept going in the direction of Sigma, the beasts became denser and denser. After some time, it was hard to tell how many hours exactly they had been traveling, but Seth could finally see some light in the darkness. With his pendant's clairvoyance he could see a dim light in the distance, this had to be the dome-like barrier of Sigma. By this time their speed had slowed. There were simply too many enemies, it was like a wall of meat that stood in their way. They were still kilometers away from Sigma, but the whole region was filled with an army of hairy beasts and others that were scrambling over each other to get there. It was hard cutting a way through these things, and the crowd only became denser. Even the Golem Knights didn't help a lot in quickening their pace. Of course, Seth could have started letting Puffles and Tatzel help. Or the other strong golems like Ceres and Wolfram. But the blacksmith had a better solution. Although these things could help strengthen the golems a little by absorbing the attributes with their weapons, they didn't hold any experience. There was no need to preserve their souls, so there was no reason to hold back on them. Are you sure about that? The Great Me is a lot better than her, the Ivisor argued. But you can't carry all of them. They might still be of use later on. Yay, Tatzel contributed in anticipation. Everyone to me, they exclaimed. Suddenly, the twilight of the beyond was broken apart by pale blue light. The group of vampires surrounding Seth and the row of beasts they were currently fighting was encircled by a wall of fire that kept out the rest of the army surrounding them. Those creatures that stood in the middle of the initial wall of flames still had the best fate as they directly turned to ashes. What is this? The vampires called out in terror, seeing the hairy beasts catch fire like tinder. The mindless beasts of the beyond started screeching in terror, fear, and pain when touched by the eerie flames. As the fire greedily devoured their bodies, they started running in panic, distributing the fire among their allies. This was the great thing about fire. Seth only sustained the ring with mental power using his pyromancy. The flames that started searing its way through the horde of beasts, fueled themselves. Is that you're doing? Vlad asked, perplexed, unable to look away from the bright fire, looking up to the sky. It's a little early to be surprised, he told Vlad before turning to the crowd. We are changing the plan a little. I'm calling a friend now, don't start panicking, he warned the stumped vampires. The next moment, a huge snake appeared from the ground beneath their feet. It was so huge, that even the confident vampires cowered in its overpowering presence. Python, Seth's strongest golem and original mom of Tatzel, lifted her giant head and observed the situation. Her presence had only strengthened since the time during the evaluation, since Seth had left her to her own devices during the time they were home. The reincarnation of a divine beast had spent her time hunting in the mountains, sometimes with Tatzel, often alone. Seth had no idea what level she was now, but she had definitely grown stronger. Again, you did not call me out for a fight, correct? The blacksmith heard her mental sigh. He couldn't help it. It was hard meeting enemies that would need him to call Python to fight them. Correct, please open your mouth and let them board, Seth asked her politely. The giant snake rolled her crystal eyes and lowered the armored skill to the ground. Okay, everyone, please enter Python. She will carry us for the rest of the way. Seth said, like it was absolutely natural to just board a giant skeleton golem like it was a carriage. The vampires were insecure at first, but at the bard's urging they slowly started getting into the golem. That Vlad played the example and walked in first also helped them get over their aversion. All vampires, even Genevieve, entered the snake. Seth on the other hand took a seat on her head. While Puffles returned to the pet space for some rest, Tatzel took the chance to sit beside Seth and travel with his mom. As much as the snakelet was looking forward to the journey, Seth was up there because he had a task. When Python was their bullet train, that would transport the troops, Seth was the one building the rails for her. The random spreading of fire among the beasts was a nice side effect but not the crux of the matter. He switched the Wraithguard back to his second glove of the fire spirit before concentrating for a moment. Ounce appeared playing a solemn melody as Seth started humming. The vampires inside Python did not resist, as the music lulled them into a sweet trance. As the demonic tune entered their ears, it pictured an image of their childhood. One that never happened. Sitting there for hours, staring into open flame. Something in it had a power, they could barely tear their eyes away. A whisper then entered their little ears. A voice spoke to them. All you have now, is the fire and the place it needs to reach. Don't you ever tame your demons, but try keep them on a leash. In their dream, they lived a life enraptured by the fire and their peace always depended on the ashes in their wake. This was the dream of a demon, a lullaby for an arsonist. And as the vampire sunk into the demon's dream, Seth was filled with power. This lullaby was the dream of Zaphon, a demon Seth had already connected to on a previous occasion. This time the bard did nothing crazy and the soothing music and dreaming vampires were reciprocated with a steady stream of power. While his listeners were sourcing him the power, Seth lifted his arm and swung it down in a chop. A straight wall of fire rose from the ground, splitting the sea of bodies before them. Spreading his arms far apart, the wall split into two, opening a free road for Python to travel along. Ding! Your title, Arsonist Leave 2, had evolved into Pyromaniac. You have inspired others to become arsonists. All fire-related skills are strengthened. Ding! Your skill Pyromancy Leave 9 had become Pyromancy Leave Max. With the level of the skill and the improvement of his title, the flames suddenly exploded with power, as the efficiency increased even further. The walls cascaded away from the path he created, covering the beasts on both sides in tsunamis of fire. Ravenously the flames started devouring, and the blacksmith felt inadvertently reminded of the past. His very first time, when the flames spread like a wildfire through Alpha. Just that it wasn't streets filled with grass this time, but an army of monsters vanishing in a blaze. Chapter 548. Field of Flowers. She didn't know for how long she had been asleep. When she finally came to, her head was leaning against the cold glass of the bus window. What a pretty field of flowers, Mina mumbled, looking below with a hazy gaze. Wow, it's really beautiful, a high-pitched voice agreed with her. The small fairy had slept in her arms and woke up when Mina started moving. She, too, looked out the window at the field of bright blue flowers that covered the city, with their glowing petals drifting in the wind. As her mind slowly cleared, Mina realized that this was not a field of flowers. The city below stood in flames, blazing in roaring contrast to the darkness and twilight of this world. You woke up. How do you two feel? Bulko asked friendly. Okay, I guess, she answered, still a little drowsy. She had a hard time recalling what happened. Looking down at the burning city, she couldn't help but think of Seth. Doesn't this look like Seth's fire? She mumbled. It is. It totally is. I've seen this before, he managed to follow us somehow. Finn cheered. Hearing the fairy jubilati, everyone looked out the windows, at the flaming tide that was rolling through the city. The other members of Yule Cat's Fur were a little speechless, as they had never seen Seth use fire to this extent, but they didn't doubt Finn's cheers. He can do something like that. Yvette and Cade looked in disbelief at the scenes. Since Seth had mostly kept to his role as a bard during their time together, they had no idea he was capable of something like this. Why didn't he do that during the examination? Yvette felt wronged. She had truly feared for their lives when they faced Nadina at that time. Seeing the blacksmith pull this kind of card in this situation, she couldn't help but question his decisions during the evaluation. He probably had his reasons. Mina tried to calm the sane Tess. I'm sure if there really had been any danger, he would have used it, she argued. Should we go look for him, or continue with the towers? Mike asked into the round. During Mina's and Finn's nap, the team had changed their strategy. After coming back with the information they gathered and two knocked-out members, Dylan suggested a change in strategy. Instead of entering the core room, they blasted the corresponding floor from outside. Since there was no durable core, but just a formation wall, the space mage thought this to be the more viable method, with two members missing. While Dylan blew a hole in the hull, the other casters simply concentrated on demolishing the room with magic, ignoring the guardian. It was truly an unfair design, for people used to the principle of a dungeon. Not only would people have to fight hordes of monsters to reach this room, the boss in this case was actually just a diversion. Even if they managed to kill these sludge beasts, if the people of Sigma had left the walls intact, all this would still have happened. But this also meant they could ignore the guardian and destroy the walls from a distance. While Mina and Finn were out cold, the team had already finished 3 more towers before the fire appeared. We could become a lot faster if Seth joins us, Bulko commented. Maybe we could even destroy all of the towers and bring back the whole of Sigma, Lixis suggested. What do you think, Dylan? Mike asked the strongest person currently on the bus. We should look for him. If he can help us, I will have more mana left to prepare for our return, he finally stated after giving it some thought. Although they didn't know how long it would take to find Seth, it couldn't be that long. Taking into account that they only managed to clear 4 towers in the past few hours, if they coordinated with Seth, their speed would probably increase exponentially. Steering the shuttle, Mike turned toward the sea of fire. Seth would probably be somewhere in there. Oh, yeah, since you woke up. Don't you have something to explain to us, Finn? Mike asked from the front. What could you mean? Finn tried to play over it. You turning into that giant and beating the hell out of that thing, the party leader elaborated. Oh, that. She seemed troubled and looked around. Finn learned the ancient magic skill of transformation. It is a skill of my people, but it is still hard to control, she said, blushing a little. In the end, she stayed silent about the princess giving it to her. When Finn saw Mina like that, Finn. I couldn't control my anger. With big round tears in her eyes, she looked up to the Catwoman on whose lap she was still sitting. She felt guilty for her conflicted feelings. She liked Seth, but Seth liked Mina. If Mina wasn't there, Finn could have him, but Finn also liked Mina a lot and couldn't deal with her envy. Mina stroked the fairy brute's head with a smile. It's okay, Finn, she said with a sympathetic voice. She bent over and whispered in her ears so only Finn could hear her. Quickly hurry and master that skill so you can join us. Don't worry, I'm sure Seth will also go along with it if you can grow to human size. Even if he doesn't immediately, I'm here to support you, she guaranteed the fairy her support. It was a rare moment for Finn to be speechless. She just didn't know how to put her emotions in words. It may have seemed like a trivial worry, but for the fairy, a big knot was unraveled. She didn't doubt the words of Mina, the deviant, and hugged her cheeks tightly. Their emotional bonding was disrupted when Cade suddenly exclaimed. Isn't that Python over there? Really? Wow, he's really serious then. Yvette sighed. The fire was happily spreading across the city. The blacksmith had stopped actively controlling the fire, aside from the path he created for Python. It was a lot better when it came to resource management, he just kept singing and clearing the path. Following the wave of fire, the giant snake entered the city, barely fitting into the wide streets between high-risers. The indiscernible mass of creatures, limbs, and eyes that filled the gaps between buildings was too convoluted to escape from the inferno. Weaker beasts turned to ashes, the stronger ones were flattened by Python waltzing along the way. Barreling their way towards the glowing dome that started flashing as if it would collapse soon, Seth noticed movement overhead. There it was, his flying school bus, probably filled with all his friends. Python, do you think you could open us some space? The snake mom didn't say anything and moodily came to a halt in the middle of a wide crossing. A nova of earth spike ripped away the paving and shoved away the mass of burning beasts and bodies, clearing a nice circle. Seth pushed away the fire within the circle, creating a place for the shuttle to land. Seth, the Mina called out as she directly jumped out of the shuttle and slowly floated down with feather fall. The bard stopped his song and directing caught her in his arms. They shared a deep couple's greeting. Seth. Finn joined after the two separated, hugging his cheek. Finn, you are okay. I'm glad. The shuttle landed on the demolished crossing before the several times bigger snake. The rest of the crew alighted from the shuttle. I'm glad all of you are okay. But that was stupid. Why would you just up and enter a place with things like the ethnarchs lurking, he scolded, but he was too relieved to do it seriously. I'm sorry. It was because my lady felt it was urgent to retrieve Ms. Albright. Dylan apologized openly. Seth only noticed the additional cast at this point. There were Cade and an old wizard in a white, expensive-looking robe, that fit his white beard and hair. Oh, so we were actually looking for Cade, huh? And you are? I'm sorry, I previously hid my identity with a robe. I am Dylan, a space grand magus and enchanter from Krina, he introduced himself with a bow. Oh, a space mage? Interesting. Since you are all here, I guess you are up to something, the blacksmith asked. He judged it by the absence of Lena among them. They spent the next 20 minutes roughly exchanging their experiences and plans going forward from here. The party told Seth about their plan to evacuate the people of Sigma to Delta through a portal. Oh, cool, you actually have a plan. Well, I have Vlad and a pack of sleeping vampires in the belly of Python and told them a grand story about salvation to make them come along. Chapter 549. Break. The flames were raging in the city just outside the dome. Tens of meters high, they devoured the masses of beasts that had been storming against the dome in their flight. So, this is what happened back then, Lena mumbled, remembering the report of what happened in the forests of Alpha. She was standing at the window of Cade's old room in the police headquarters and was looking down at the edge of the dome in the distance. Over the past hours, the last remnants of Sigma's adventurers had been struggling to sustain the faltering barrier. The number of monsters surging against the dome had significantly increased after they were transported to this world, even more than they had expected during the meeting. At this time Lena was almost alone in the HQ, together with non-combat personnel and children. It was so dire that even the low-level civilians with fitting skills had joined and contributed what little mana they had to keep the defense standing. The advent of destruction that came over the monsters in the form of raging fire, was a sliver of hope for the defenders. But it was a double-edged sword. In their panic to get away from the fire, these grotesque monsters doubled their endeavors to get past the barrier, the only viable escape route as everything else was either filled with other beasts or the despicable fire. Now it was a battle against the time. If the defender could hold out until the flames did their work, they would be saved. However, if they failed, who knew whether they would fall to the fire the same way the monsters did? Cade. You aren't Cade, are you the princess from another world? A girl with big sparkling eyes asked from the door. Ho, didn't your parent teach you that you can't just enter other people's rooms? The princess asked amused. The door was stood open, the girl said innocently, with her hand still on the door handle. Oh, really? She chuckled. Of course, she understood the girl had not really come looking for someone else, but it was a welcome distraction from the imminent doom outside. She was interested in what the little scamp could want from her. You seem like a curious girl. Why don't you come inside and we talk a little? I'm Lena from Krina and you are. Her eyes lit up when her elaborate scheme worked and got her the chance to speak with the mysterious princess. I'm Selene Pierce. My papa is the boss of this place, she bragged. So you are the daughter of Vlad. What are you doing here all alone? The girl seemed a little troubled and looked left and right in the hallway before entering the room. Is it true that you are a powerful princess? She whispered after coming closer. Lena crouched down to get on her eye level. I guess you could say that, she whispered back with a smile. Then can you grant me a wish? Her eyes looked desperate and hopeful. If it's within my ability, what would her wish be, if she looked at her like this? Can you please protect my mama and papa and brother? Lena was stumped for a moment. She had not expected such a mature request. As clueless as the child may have seemed, even an 8-year-old picked up on how dire the situation was. But could the princess make such a promise? She didn't have any power to keep this promise in an emergency situation and all her people were currently out there fighting. I will do whatever I can, I promise, she answered with a smile. Facing the girl's clear, hopeful eyes, Lena was unable to let her down. Yay, thank you, she cried out as if this solved all the problems without a doubt. Being hugged tightly by the little girl, Lena could only smile wryly. The girl kept asking her about all kinds of princess stuff. Selena? Where are you? A soft voice called out from the corridor outside. Mama, her face lit up in happiness. She quickly ran out where she jumped into the arms of a beautiful, elegant lady. Her slightly disheveled hair and worn clothes could not hide her beauty and aura. Catching her daughter with a smile, she looked over to Lena who was standing in her door. I'm sorry if she bothered you. I'm Elizabeth Pierce, you have to be Princess Lena. Yes, nice to meet you. Heezing desperately operated the runes of the barrier like Vlad had taught him. The current captain tried to manipulate the power flow to strengthen the vital point of the barrier and fix the myriad of fractures. His problem was that the dome was pressured from almost everywhere and was made up mostly of cracks at this point. Their defense was running on hot air and fire was knocking on their door. Ugh, he groaned when the biggest crack yet appeared in the barrier. Among the indiscernible mass of being was a giant creature that slammed against the dome in reckless abandon for itself and its allies. As unwilling as he was, he had to face the truth. They would lose this battle of attrition. No, he refused to give up. There had to be some way. Right, the biggest pressure came from the fleeing crowd in the west. What if he diverted the energy? They may have a chance of survival. Defenders of Sigma, the barrier is about to break, he announced over a makeshift system of speakers that spanned all along the barrier. To prevent us from being completely surrounded, I will divert the energy from the west that is about to break to sustain the rest of the barriers. I ask every adventurer capable of combat to assemble in the west and get ready to defend the citizens. Although some of the defenders looked panicked and some probably wanted to run, most had a solemn expression. They had had more than enough time to come to terms with reality. This was actually better than most expected, at least they would be surrounded by the squirming ocean of nightmares. I asked the citizens to either evacuate from the eastern side of the wards or to also get ready. He finished his hurried speech. Even if they were low-level and barely trained, everyone had some skills and items for self-defense. This was the best he could do. He barely managed to divert the energy, stopping the whole dome from breaking apart. At the same moment, the fire came over the beasts crashing into the barrier, and the west side of the dome finally crumbled. A hole, tens of meters high, opened on the western side and a wave of monsters invaded the wards. They crashed into the rows of defenders, but the fatigued and pitiful rest of Sigma's adventurers could not hold their ground against the overwhelming number of monsters. There were simply not enough capable people, and they didn't have enough time to prepare themselves. Beasts, some partially burning, quickly spread through the city. Although the weaker ones faced heavy opposition, the strong ones just cut through Sigma's people. *T. Heasing cursed and left his post. He had to get back to the police HQ. The creatures were faster than he expected, and there were still a lot of important people at the station. Most prominently Vlad's family and the princess. But he was too slow. When he entered the streets, he already faced a scene of chaos. People were fighting desperately, but many were just mowed down by the horde. He didn't expect it to become this bad. Had he made a mistake? Heasing did his best to make his way toward the HQ when he heard a chaotic noise of destruction from behind him in the west. Buildings collapsed to the left and right as giant rock spikes shot up from the ground and opened up a gorge in the mass of monsters. Between the spikes that pierced the skyscrapers outside of the wards, a giant beast raised its head. A serpent several stories high roared to the sky, and Heasing's heart slid down to his knees. What had they done to deserve such punishment? As he watched in terror, he saw several specters released from the beasts. They weaved through the crowd with unbelievable speed, and flowers of blood sprouted wherever they came past. Heasing already said goodbye to his life when the wave of ghosts passed him, only for him to realize that he was still alive. The beasts that had just been ripping apart citizens were lying on the ground, lifeless. People were standing up and looked around with looks of disbelief. The crisis had ended in the blink of an eye. The fountains of blood they had seen belonged to the beasts, not the people of Sigma. Chapter 550. Boys will be boys. Could you take Selene to the protective bunker? I have to get my son. Elizabeth asked Lena in a hurry. They had not talked for long, but seemed to be enough for the woman to entrust her daughter to the princess. She was a little stumped, but seeing the mother's gaze she nodded in agreement. Mama, don't go, the little girl tried to stop her mother. Selene, be a good girl. The princess is still new here. She needs you to find her way to the bunker. Mama will follow once I found your brother, she convinced the girl to go with Lena. When she finally managed to shake off her daughter, she charged out to look for her son, while Selene was looking at her leaving. Come, you are a brave and intelligent girl, right? Your mother gave you the quest to save the princess, are you up for the task? With a brave nod, the little girl grasped Lena's hand and led the way to the shelter in the underground section of the police station. It was originally one of the subterranean greenhouses of Sigma that was fortified for defense and reinforced with magic. It was one of many, but there were still far from enough. The underground room was chock-full as the scarce guards ushered in the people. None of the faces had any hope. Panic and fear were prevalent, only some seemed to have realized that this was most likely their grave. Sigma had no more forces. If the beasts came all the way to this point, even if they did not manage to get into the shelter, they would be unable to leave. At that point, they would stand before the choice to either die a gruesome death or one of starvation. Selene stayed with Lena close to the entrance to look out for her mother. They are closing the door. Lena, they can't close the door. Mama isn't here, yet, the girl said in a panic when they saw the guard closing the thick blast doors. Don't worry, maybe she went to a different shelter, she tried to calm the young girl. There is no other shelter here, she cried, tears running down her cheeks. Why, you promised you would protect them. You promised, the girl hugged her tightly, her tears and snot soaking into her robe. Ugh! Why did she have to promise that? She was sure Dylan and the others would come back before something like this happened. She looked at the little girl with a troubled face before she made a decision. Don't worry. I will look for them. Promise me you stay here, okay? Seeing the girl nod, Lena charged out of the shelter just before the blast doors were shut. It would cost her dignity if she broke it. Probably 20 or 30 points, she couldn't take such a loss. Although she was not a combatant, she was confident that she wouldn't die here. As a descendant of the imperial family of Krna, she also had a number of trump cards. The hallway outside of the shelter was empty. They had closed the door because no more people came. She looked left and right before she ripped a scroll and turned invisible. It was a high-grade magic scroll that turned her invisible for an hour, as long as she did not enter a fight. Ample time to look for Selene's mother. She activated the magic on her shoes, that allowed her to use the quick feet skill of assassins, and rushed up the stair that had led them underground. Lena followed the path she had taken with Selene back towards the room she had stayed in. This was where she had seen Elizabeth for the last time, but nobody was there. She walked down the corridor in the opposite direction, where the mother had gone when she saw her last time. Aimlessly wandering wouldn't help her, so the princess took some time to think about it. She went off to look for her son, so where would a young boy go during a terrible time of crisis? If only Lena had any idea about young boys. Maybe he would go to the kitchen to get food? There was a cafeteria on the first floor, maybe the boy went to get food? It was her best idea, so she turned toward the stairwell. On the way down, he came face to face with beasts. The sight of these monsters up close almost made her gag. Why did these creatures all have to look like a drug-induced nightmare? What made it worse was the fact that they had not been there before. They were spreading quicker than expected. She had to hurry. Invisible and equipped with quick feet, she could freely move among the beasts and continued her way down. She had crossed half the way back to the first floor when she suddenly heard the noise of battle. There was no time to think. She couldn't just keep going and quickly followed the sound. Turning around the corner, Lena spotted a woman with raven black hair and a young child at her side. She swung a Dane axe with an agitated cry and split a grotesque monster made up of mismatched body parts in two. The princess was lucky, she had found Elizabeth. But Elizabeth was not so lucky, as she was facing 5 or 6 of these creatures. Besides the hairy being, it was hard to discern the numbers of the amorphous nightmare beasts. Especially as the ground was already littered with more parts of them. The mother was breathing heavily, it seemed her stamina wasn't too great. Lena had to hurry. Still invisible, she charged past the group of beasts and threw an explosive in their midst, exposing herself. "You!" Elizabeth cried out. "Get down!" she cried out as she lunged at mother and child to tackle them to the ground as a huge explosion happened behind them. It was a contained and condensed fire bomb. The fireball had a specific radius and thoroughly incinerated everything in its radius. A high-pitched howl of pain erupted from the blazing roars of the fireball but quickly waned and was swallowed by the fires. It was another of Lena's trump cards. These kinds of magic bombs were hard to make and only meant for emergency cases. They could easily turn most Levadi adventurers to ashes. "Are you okay?" the princess asked the 2 stragglers slightly out of breath. "Why yes, but what are you doing here? Where is Selene?" Elizabeth asked exasperated. "She's in safety. I'm here because she asked me to protect you," the princess explained concisely as she stood up again. "What about those things?" the mother asked, nodding at the fading fireball and the charred remains of the creatures. "Don't worry, this kind of artifact should be able to kill any beast under Levadi," she bragged a little, but her face fell when she heard a sound from behind. Had the charred skeleton just moved? The biggest lanky corpse in the middle of the group suddenly twitched and raised its burned head. Between its exposed jaws it held another carbonized piece from the bodies around it. The thing was eating. Quickly the princess also noted that it was regenerating at a visible rate. It was a very tall, naturally lanky humanoid with knobby joints. The mix of human and canine's teeth were exposed by a short snout without lips. The big eyes were deep-set and bulging at the same time. It took the princess a moment to realize why. The creature had no eyelids. **T, she cursed. The bomb had not killed it and it even healed as it fed on the corpses around it. "Let's hide," the princess urged them into the adjacent room and threw another bomb at the naked thing. Throwing the metal door shut behind her, she took a moment to scan the room they had entered. The armory. Of course. Where do boys go to play? The armory, it was obvious. "Can you lock the door or something?" Lena asked in a hurry. The modern door didn't have such a simple thing as a key lock with a conveniently sticking key on the inside of the door. "Oh, yes. Let me." Elizabeth jumped to her side and started mashing in numbers on the keypad on the wall. It beeped 2 times and they heard several bolts in the wall locking the metal door shut. They just let out a sigh of relief when something smashed into the door from the other side with tremendous force. This answered Lena's pending worry, that the bats had even survived the second incendiary bomb. Looking around she found the armory mostly empty, with only mediocre weapons left in the stands. Tisk. She clicked her tongue and brought out her personal weapon. Even though she was a lady, her class as a royal granted her knightly weapon mastery. Similar to the general skill weapon mastery Seth held, it was a skill that granted mastery for several different weapons that were the signature of knights. Her personal weapon was a slender sword for stabbing, almost like a broad rapier. Arcs of lightning crackled along the blade. This was the lightning needle, a legendary weapon that offered the wielder powerful bursts of power but had strict usage conditions. The beast had survived her bombs, which meant she couldn't go easy. The princess ripped a piece of paper and took her stance, facing the door. Sweat started running down her face as she concentrated and readied the weapon's strongest attack. "What are you doing?" Elizabeth asked from the side when Lena stopped moving and only watched the slowly deforming door. "I only have this one attack. I have to make sure it hits," she explained with pressed together lips. Her whole body was tense, like a drawn bow ready to fire. Pow! With the last hit, the door finally fell inwards and the beast rushed in, faster than any of the women could react, and crashed into an invisible wall. The paper she had ripped before was a barrier scroll that could instantly erect a protective bubble around the user. Confused and with its charge halted, it had no other way than to face Lena's prepared attack. After images followed her movements as she lunged forward into the stab. The images rushed to the tip of the sword where they turned into a lightning beam. The attack hit the beast squarely in the chest and cleanly penetrated the fiend, but she knew this would probably not be enough. By slightly changing her stance she diffused the beam, turning it into a knockback instead of penetration. Suddenly hit by the force, the beast was flung to the door where it futilely tried to cling to the frame. In the end, it could not hold on. Its claws lost their grip and it crashed through the door on the opposite side and out the window of that room. Even if it survived the attack, even if it survived the fall, it would buy them time. The princess kneeled down, panting heavily. If only the costs and side effects were not as extreme. Before they could be happy about their little success, shadows appeared at the now destroyed door. Lena groaned, slightly pissed. They really just kept on coming. Her arms felt heavy like lead, but she lifted her weapon again. She hated this feeling. Why did she have to go through this? She wasn't a fighter. But when she looked at Elizabeth and her son behind her and thought of Seleni's face, she did not regret her promise. Would have been nice, but she really regretted it. She swore to herself to never make any promises that could involve fighting ever again if she wasn't sure to have a subordinate to delegate it to. Chapter 551 Reunion. After Python breached through the masses of monsters, she breathed a cloud of vampires at the city below. Or in other words, the vampires alighted from her body through her mouth. With Vlad at their helm, they charged into the dome to hunt the monsters that had gotten in. The vampire had insisted on going in first, as he and the vampires were faster and more numerous. Although Seth did not necessarily agree, he didn't refuse Vlad's request to jump into the danger. "I will also go ahead and make sure Her Highness Lena is safe," Dylan informed them, before flying off into the city. The group around Seth stayed on Python's back and entered the city with her. With those two gone, they were left with dealing with the aftermath. Looking up ahead, he was forced to face the present reality again. Although they had hurried here, it had still come to this. Corpses, injured people, and blood filled the streets. Some of the defenders were barely standing and looking at the giant snake in fear. Moans of pain, cries of sorrow, and cries of panic from inside the buildings where the vampires had missed some of the beasts echoed through the now almost lifeless streets. Seth sighed. The vampires were strong, but they did only kill in a rush. "I guess we should get to work," he concluded and started giving everyone instructions. Their kind-off priests including him stayed back while the others and Seth's team of golem knights went to get rid of the remnant beasts that were still killing people somewhere in the building in the vicinity. Volko, Yvette, Seth, Tatzel, and Finn started treating the injured in the vicinity. The blacksmith did not summon Puffles. Despite being a powerful healer, as he would not have been helpful image-wise. It already took them some effort to convince the injured defenders that they were here to help, thanks to the menacing-looking snake behind them. Although the Eye-Visor was grumpy, he understood why he had to hide for now. Even though they managed to show their good intentions, people were not optimistic at first, and it was quite clear why. Many of the wounds had a strange energy dwelling within them as if they were cursed. It took the skills given by the Golden Fleece to treat these wounds. Tatzel, who could mimic the skills after a while, also joined Seth with these patients. The morale improved a lot when people saw that they could actually heal them, and the people they healed also joined them in helping. They also informed them of the current situation. Most of the people still in the vicinity were what was left of Sigma's adventurers. They were all ranging between leave 20 and 50, with most of them somewhere in the 30s. But there were still other civilians as the barrier broke quicker than people could evacuate. Whatever remnants of the defenders Seth and the other managed to save would go around to rally the other survivors to search for more injured to bring them back to the healers, if possible. Volko, Finn, and Yvette were in charge of most healing, while Seth and Tatzel would purify the weird curses from affected people. All the while Seth couldn't help but doubt the situation. Did people die? Yes. Was it bad? Sure. But he couldn't help but suspect that this was the calm before the storm. Some actors had not yet entered the stage, the supposed rulers of this world. Despite wreaking havoc in their home, nobody had come to admonish them with a serious look and a threateningly raised index finger. Were these ethnarchs maybe some suckers for drama? Why did he feel like they would wait for the very last moment to thwart their plan and feast upon their despair, or something along that line? The blacksmith kept thinking about what to do in that case while they were treating the people. Slowly they built up quite a crowd and the flow of new bloody, injured bodies waned. Their team and the golems also returned after getting rid of all the monsters they could find. I think you can deal with the rest on your own. Seth finally concluded, speaking to the contemporary leader of the people they had saved. The team assembled and got on the shuttle to go to the police HQ. Following Cade's instructions, they aimed for the headquarters. Seth finally felt that they had some time on their hand. With Dylan out of the picture and no pending emergency afoot, the blacksmith could finally bring up a matter that was close to his heart. Yvette, it's time, he whispered to her seriously after taking the sane test to the side. Time? She asked a little confused before her expression brightened in understanding. Right, put them in here, he instructed her and brought out the small golden chest he had received from Apollo. It even came with instructions for usage, sort of. The process was quite simple. He had to put the cursed dragon scales into the box and the divine power within it would slowly offset the curse. In the end, the chest would lose its power in exchange for dispelling the curse. Just putting them in here will do the trick, the saintess asked unsurely. I don't think a god like Apollo needs to lie to me, he answered certainly. Yvette nodded and put out the sealed dragon scales into the chest he was holding up. Once he closed the lid, the golden chest started turning black, starting from the middle of the lid. The process would be over once it completely changed color. What were you two whispering? Mina asked curiously. We just finished an overdue business, Seth answered with a smile. The chest was safely stored in his inventory. He felt a lot calmer now and quite excited at the thought that he now not only had the legendary scales, but also the special carapace of Scorpio. But he had to remind himself that this wasn't the time to be distracted. They would reach the HQ soon. Some hours before. Your Highness! Dylan cried out as he rushed into the building through the hole in the facade. He had seen the explosions from the incendiary bombs from afar. He knew they were part of Lena's self-defense arsenal. Shortly after he witnessed the blast of the lightning needle. Ugh, you took way too long, he was greeted by a pissed Lena. She was panting heavily and covered in sweat. Her clothes were in tatters and covered in dust. Her hands were bleeding, and bruised from wielding the sword she was holding. The lady beside her did not look much better, with her worn Dane axe in her hands. They were surrounded by a room of mutilated monster corpses. The only one looking relatively fine in this scene was the young boy hiding behind the row of weapon racks. He felt a little embarrassed for only showing up right after the action had already ended. I am sorry for my lateness, Your Highness, he apologized belatedly. Lena huffed but didn't pursue the topic. Let's go to Selene, she simply stated and led the way. She didn't look or talk directly at him. She passed by Dylan with the lady and her son following, giving him apologetic looks. He had never been so embarrassed in all of his career. He felt guilty that his inability had forced the princess to exert herself to this extent. Even though she tried to hide it, Dylan could easily that she was close to collapsing and his heart ached looking at her like this. However, there was nothing he could say or do to fix this, for now. The mage could only trudge along behind the two women and the young boy who descended back down toward the ground floor. When he heard the snarls of beasts in the lobby below, he hardened his resolve. This was his chance. He would do it right and protect the princess before she even got into danger. With his spatial awareness he could already scan the lobby and the presence within. The magician readied a space cutter spell that would end all of them when a man burst through the door. The battle sound could be heard all the way up to the stairs. Wielding a long sword and accompanied by several people, they slaughtered the monsters in the lobby. Dylan's thunder was stolen. Elise Beta, the leader of the men, cried out when their group entered the lobby. Vlad, the woman beside exclaimed and dashed into the man's embrace. Chapter 552. Plans and Suspicions. When Seth and the others arrived at the police headquarters, they found it secured and guarded by vampires. Vlad had already met up with Lena and they set up a command structure to manage the present people and fighters. Taking their current situation into account, Seth was not given any time for a break. While Yulkatsfur and the others were given some temporary room, the blacksmith was forced to take part in a meeting to exchange their information and decide how to continue. Currently present in the room were Lena, Dylan, Vlad, Heesing, Seth, Genevieve, and some leaders of Sigma. Although Vlad had already informed Lena and the higher-up of Sigma of what happened from his perspective and Seth knew the rough situation of Sigma from Dylan and the others, they had to match their information and get everyone on the same level before coming up with a plan. There were technically two rough solutions. Lena had previously argued in favor of evacuating the populace to Delta. The quicker they managed to get everyone to safety, the smaller was the chance that any of the ethnarchs getting in their way. With the vampires taking over the fighting and guarding the breach in the barrier, I think we should destroy the rest of the towers and bring back the whole piece of Sigma. Vlad advocated fervently. It found much approval among the others from Sigma. It was understandable. Who would want to leave their home in some twilight dimension and become a refuge in a foreign district? Not wanting to leave was understandable when there was an option to bring everything back. The counter-argument was that even if they brought everything back to Earth, it would not change that Sigma district was situated at the border to the beyond and nothing would stop these beings from repeating what they did. And there was another flaw in both approaches. And leave us behind again. How typical. Genevieve commented poisonous at Vlad's suggestion. With this, she meant, that the vampire would not be able to come back to Earth with them unless the oath was broken. Which it wasn't, yet. A small detail that had not come up, yet. What do you mean? Didn't I bring Seth to defeat the 13th Ethnarch and free our people? Vlad countered as if it was natural that this was the order of things. His sister stared at him blankly while the bard broke the serious atmosphere with a fit of laughter. I didn't expect that my speech would be so potent, that even you fell for it. Shouldn't you be the one who knows the clearest, that all of it was a beautiful lie? He pointed at himself, Genevieve, and Vlad. Between the three of us, we know you never intended to spare another thought for your people, if all this had not happened. The bard's words were just the right thing to cut into Vlad's heart like a searing hot blade. The delusions built by Seth's speech that had woven together with the excuses he had made for himself, crumbled apart in one go. For the first time, Vlad really faced what he had done to his people. He had abandoned them when he couldn't take it anymore and he had used them when it was convenient for him, all with the glorious belief of doing the best thing, the right thing for everyone. The man's dissent was vividly expressed on his face and Seth spotted a smile playing around the corners of Genevieve's mouth as she watched it happen. Of course, Seth didn't mean to blame Vlad, although he couldn't agree with his actions, it didn't faze the blacksmith for he did not care about the vampires. So you really gave them an empty promise? Lena exclaimed exasperated. What do you mean? If that thing had appeared in our way at any point before coming here I would have tried to kill it and freed them. But it didn't appear. Seth said earnestly. After hearing that Vlad could literally bind them into obedience with an oath, the blacksmith had made some loose plans. It would have been a lie that his intentions were purely virtuous. Who wouldn't covet a loyal force of super-powerful people? Since they spoke about the creature with such fear, Seth had expected the 13th Ethnarch to appear in front of them and stop them, when the vampires moved into action and left their territory. But no such thing happened. Now the situation had changed. Seth had finished his quest, he had his dragon scales, and the people he cared about were beside him and in safety. They even had a good plan that would mean a happy end for most people currently present in the wards. He so absolutely had no reason to go out of his way and stay in this grotesque twilight zone full of terribly powerful beasts, just to search for one specific unknowingly powerful entity and fight it. The blacksmith would rather give up on recruiting the vampires altogether. That was, of course, only if he really couldn't pick them up on the way. Seth had a sneaking suspicion and another loose plan depending on how everything would unfold. But it was not yet time to share it. Instead, he passed the hot potato. Princess Lena, don't you maybe know of a way to break this dolt's oath and free the vampires from his promise? He asked candidly. As the princess of a multidimensional empire that had connections to many strange places, there was nothing weird about expecting her to know something about it. None. I'm sorry, she said after a heavy moment of silence. These vampires' magic of oaths was based on everything having a true name and knowing it gave them power over it. This was not a new concept, but the princess had no way to break a contract made like this, except by killing one side. Everyone's mood became heavy. No matter what plan they chose, they all knew that they would need the help of the vampires. The best solution would have been an earnest way to free them. Having no such way put them before a dilemma that bore heavy on most of their minds. Would they tell the vampires and hope that they would help anyway? Or would they keep them in blissful ignorance until they already got what they wanted? In that case, would Genevieve even let them do that? For some reason, it never crossed anybody's mind that they could try and pressure the blacksmith into finding the 13th ethnarch while they took care of the towers. They didn't realize, but something in Seth's politely spoken words had made it unmistakably clear that this was not the solution to their problem. Hearing Lena did not have a method to save the vampires and seeing them all troubled, the bard saw his chance. Now was the perfect time to reveal his plan. "Is it time yet?" a disembodied voice asked in the void. "Just a little longer," another voice answered. "Yes, yes. Let them squirm a little longer," a third said. "Isn't it fun to watch them run around? Thinking they have any hope to escape," a fourth agreed. "But don't they?" a fifth, slightly higher one asked. "Don't they what?" the fourth said. "Have hope to escape?" That oldie seemed capable. The fifth explained. "Now that you say it, that guy with the snake makes me feel uneasy. The fire he used, and he had an unsettling aura about him," a young sixth voice added. "Unnecessary worries. No matter what they do, we can just step in and stop it. Imagine their expressions when they are just about to succeed, only for all they hope to come crashing down and crumble apart when we step in," the second said certainly. "Their despair will be delicious," several voices said in sync. Chapter 553. Somewhere else, 15. Muir Empire. Adam really couldn't complain. Of course, there were a lot of things that had gone wrong in his life up to this point. Like being turned into an artificial druid and losing most memories of his life before that. But right now, sitting on a luxurious sofa with two subtle, well-endowed merman ladies in his arms, he really had nothing to complain about. They fed him some sweet foreign fruits while his hands were free to wander. He had to admit that Prince Muir knew how to enjoy life. He definitely took a risk when struck a deal with Muir, who came out to really be a capable but unwanted heir to the throne. As their council of elders tried to get rid of him, Muir mastered the life of debauchery. And Adam was given an ample taste of these benefits that came with their deal. With the skills and abilities he had developed after he woke up in that underground laboratory, he had lived the life of a rebel leader and guerrilla warrior because the situation asked it of him. But who didn't want an enjoyable and easy life? Especially if it came with revenge built in. It had now been a few weeks since they came to the capital of Muir, and Adam was allowed to freely use the prince's VIP access to the most illustrious establishments of the red light districts and high society. While the artificial druid was given a well-deserved and much-needed holiday, Muir would join him once in a while in between preparing their coup to get rid of the council. However, the druid didn't just enjoy his time. Although the prince had not asked him to, he was working on setting up his own network with his skills. One in the shadows of the Muir Empire's capital and even past its borders. After living in the war-torn Beta, it was almost a habit. Since the social structure of mermen was based to a big part on the mental power and ability to make others submit to one's will. Adam didn't know what they had done to him in that laboratory, but his own power easily rivaled royalty and could even overcome it, if he put his mind to it. The door of the VIP suite flew open and Prince Muir walked in energetically. He threw himself on the opposite sofa and grabbed the bottle of wine from the table between them. The prince looked tired as he emptied the bottle with long, well-practiced gulps. "Had a hard day?" the druid asked as he had fun with the ladies. He was originally human and had already mastered his transformation, but he found that these mermaidens were not bad at all even when he still preferred humans. Muir sighed. "Yeah, but the preparations are finally finished. All that is left is for you to move accordingly and we can start taking over," he answered his question. "Don't make me ask for everything. What's the first step?" Adam asked, interested. He enjoyed his time here, but he didn't forget that he came for revenge. Muir sat up and looked at the girls. "Dears, could you two get us some more wine and a few more of your friends?" the prince spoke to the girls Adam was currently having fun with. They understood the hint, nodded, and hurried to get more women and alcohol. With them gone, the princess finally spoke. "Well, I will give you a list of nobles and their relatives. Some to get rid of, some to kidnap. I think your little network you built should be more than fit for this. With their backing, we will drive the council into a corner and then..." The druid kept listening attentively as Muir explained to him his plan to take over the Muir Empire. It became quite obvious that he had put a lot of thought into this over the past weeks. Adam added a few points here and there, but other than those the plan was good to go. After a while, a group of girls returned with more drinks and they kept partying deep into the night, until they separated, each with their own handful of girls. Y City. The silent darkness of Y City's night was broken by the blaring of sirens as explosions shattered the barriers of the Special Defense Department. A crowd of people surged towards the building with incredible speed. Their skins were of a dark red hue and steaming, while their eyes were empty. Animalistic roars and spittle left their throats. Their hands were empty, with claw-like nails. The smooth, almost elegant-looking cloaks gave a stark contrast to their bestial behavior. Shortly after their charge started, the cracking of shots exploded into the night and bullets rained on the mob. Even though they were sieved by projectiles, unless they were shot in the heart or head, the berserkers wouldn't stop. "Where is the director?" one of the leaders called out. "I don't know. We can't reach him," his subordinate answered seriously. As the soldiers were trying to get the situation under control, an invisible figure sneaked past them. It did not sneak inside but came out. Holding its side that was bleeding profusely, the figure traveled through the city unseen, only stopping for a moment to drink a healing potion. The city round it changed as it ran all the way to the edge of the safe zone. While the center was almost unharmed, the buildings became more damaged, worn, and empty towards the edge. Although it was still in the safe zone, these were the slums where the bare minimum of adventurers and hunters patrolled. It was the place where the shady business the lawless ruins past the safe zone's border. Cheap bars, clubs, and questionable brothels had filled these parts where the incarcerated and unfortunate struggled to carve a life out for themselves. The figure walked through a dark alley where he took off the hood and became visible. After the short man could be seen again, he mixed in the pedestrians on the street. The wounds had healed and nobody saw the blood on his dark suit. He stopped before a crater in the road. It was almost like a sinkhole or the tunnel of something. Walking down a huge slab of the street at the rim that led down to a door, he passed the queue standing in front of it. With the flip of a small card, the bouncer let him in and he entered the exclusive club through the VIP entrance. This club was not very special. There were many clubs that had been opened in the abandoned subterranean parts of the district. They were a lot safer in case of a sudden break. Officially, authorities put up with them because they also hindered more dungeons forming in these unused underground passages and shelters. Unofficially, there was a lot of money flowing into some pockets to keep these clubs running. Coming up a luxurious flight of stairs, he reached the VIP room where he faced a single stoic man sitting on a couch. He looked as if someone took all the measurements of a human and multiplied them by 2 to 3 times, except the height. Despite being a boulder of a man, he wore a perfectly fitting, well-tailored suit that made him look like a businessman and less like a bouncer or a troll. The chunky rings on his fingers would have been armlets for the short man. "Is it done?" he asked with a deep rumbling voice. He didn't even look up at the man as he was polishing something small and delicate in his massive hands. "Yes, sir," the assassin said before putting a bloody dagger and a severed hand on the table. "It wasn't easy. Even when he couldn't see me, the illusion was very tricky." The giant man looked at the dirty things with slight disgust before he sighed. "As long as you succeeded, the lady will be happy. With this, your role ends. So I am finally free." "Yes. You will be free." Suddenly, the invisibility cloak that had protected the assassin's life until now started constricting around his neck. He tried to resist, he tried to take it off using the system, but he couldn't. He knelt down and was slowly strangulated to death as the big man watched unperturbed. At the same time, the same thing happened to the surviving berserkers that had attacked the Defense Department. Their collars constricted and killed anyone that could have become a witness. Chapter 554. Now you see me. The shuttle was flying through the skies of Sigma, only the light of the raging fires below to guide them. In places it passed, where alien-looking spires hid between towering skyscrapers, a giant armored snake would suddenly appear. Strangling the spires with its massive body, it easily crushed the tower to dust before vanishing again. It was not always a snake, at time it was a flying centipede that blew the tower apart with fiery light magic, a bird spewing lightning, or a weird knight in grey armor. No matter which one was up, their targets ceased to exist. 6,7, 12, 13. One by one the spires fell and nothing that emerged from them was able to fight or even so much as harm the snake in a meaningful way. This went on without a hitch at all, though it became noticeably slowed after the 12th tower fell. As Seth expected, nobody came to stop them until he reached the final, 24th structure. Once all towers were gone, they would have been able to warp the whole of Sigma that was transported here, back to Earth. As the shuttle closed in on the last, final spire, the dark skies above started to churn. The black mists of this foreign world coagulated and masses of spectral bones began to materialize, filling the heavens above. The shuttle halted in the middle of the air, unable to proceed toward the last tower. Climbing onto the roof of the vehicle floating there, was a man wearing a smooth cloak and a golden robe under it. Seth faced the indiscernible mass of fractal-patterned bones and macabre skulls of indescribable creatures. The pressure was hard to endure and the sight was nothing for a weak stomach, but Seth pulled himself together. This was his chance. Puny human, your struggles are futile. You must be the ethnarchs of the beyond. Have you finally come to stop us? The deep voice like the echo of caves echoes through the city without a discernible source, but the man had cut it off in the middle of its sentence. The voice stalked. This was not how it imagined this to go. Their victim was way too calm, this was not in the script. Seth had broken its flow and did his best to hide the hardship he went through to endure their presence and not run away immediately. He had to endure and stick to the plan for the optimal outcome. His heart ached as the number of souls in his soul space rapidly vanished through his channeling and soul trade skills, in preparation for what was to come. Hundreds of small common souls gone, almost 100 medium souls, gone. He even paid the muddled souls he had collected in Kavati Koinen. You do not seem surprised or afraid. Do you still hold the notion that you may have a chance to escape us? A voice said, almost amused. The bard almost choked, when the pressure of channeling the flood of demonic power was added to the pressure he was already enduring. When he spoke his voice was oozing with oodles of demonic power that gave weight to his words. Escape from all of you? No, I heard that you are always open to a deal. You could just crush me in the wards and end everything with your power, but wouldn't that be boring? They had waited all this time to crush their hopes in their final moment of victory, Seth was sure. It meant that although they could have stepped in at any time, they had let things go for their own entertainment. They were not too different from the gods the blacksmith had come to know. He pandered to their fancy for entertainment. Ho ho, you want to make a deal, another voice chuckled. I fancy an interesting offer, a third voice mentioned. What is it you suggest? The first voice gave him a chance. A final duel. I challenge the 13th Ethnarch to a fight one-on-one. If I win, you will not stop us from leaving this place, the blacksmith suggested. The last struggle of a valiant hero? How delightful, a voice mused. Interesting, interesting, one repeated. But what stand we to gain? The main voice he had been talking to retorted. Nothing, but an exciting show. What else could you want? How about your soul? Right, his soul. His soul? Seth was taken aback. Who were they to covet his soul? He was the one taking other people's souls, not the other way around. However, a small smile played around his lips. He was very confident in this fight, there was no reason not to agree. Fine, if I win against the 13th Ethnarch of the Beyond, keep my soul, and if you lose, everyone in Sigma, even the vampires, will be allowed to leave. Deal. Deal, come forward, 13th. The deal was finished and he could finally stop using his skills. Ding! Your skill Soul Trade Leave 2 had become Soul Trade Leave 3. He heard the notification but did not have time to take a look. There was a fight ahead of him. From the raving mass of spectral bones separated an individual. It was massive, at least 3 times as big as the 24th Ethnarch Seth had beaten before. It had a skull that resembled an alien crocodile with a mane of spikes. Facing the giant creature, Seth actually became calmer. The biggest hurdle, getting them to agree, was taken. Even when these things were incredibly powerful, they still exerted less pressure than the zombie dragon or the core worm. Still, they were existence he couldn't possibly beat if the blacksmith's skills and his fire were not technically their natural enemy. Items appeared on him. His natural advantage was not the only reason he was confident in beating this creature. On his right hand appeared the Wraith Guard, swapped for one of his gloves of the fire sprit. And with Wraith Guard he grasped the final version of the Ravenous Sog. Its aura had completely changed. It was emitting serene ghostly light, that emitted a purely malicious and evil aura. Just looking at it, could make someone shudder, without really even knowing why. Any being with a soul would sense the intense feeling of danger and doom from the blade. After the others agreed to his plan, Seth had set on finishing his biggest advantage for this battle. If he was honest, he felt like he wasted the soul of the Titanoboa Patriarch for it, but it was necessary. Seth had turned the massive soul of the giant patriarch snake into a soul armament mirroring the Ravenous Sog and used demonic runes to etch an exceedingly simple phrase into the blade. It was a text that had burned itself into his memory after reading it just once at the library of the Bard College. If he translated the runes roughly, it would have meant something along the lines of, "It's about souls, it's about power. You stay hungry, I devour." It was an inscription that could be used to extract and collect souls. After infusing it into the Ravenous Sog, the sword changed and gained a similar property to Karen's Obel. Ravenous Sog. Relic, Growth. Damage 2300. Durability, 6000. 1 will absorb blood and soul energy to repair and strengthen itself. 2 will absorb part of the target's blood and soul energy to heal and strengthen the user. 3 active skill, Lacerate. 4 passive skill, Strength of the Minotaur. 5 plus 50% skill damage. 6 plus 50% magic damage. 7 plus 20% damage in dark places, Karen's Obel. 8 absorb willpower on hit. 9 curse of lethargy on hit. 10 soul bane on hit. 11 overeating. An exceedingly excellent sword created by craftsman Smith with minute attention to detail and a clear function in mind. The superior craftsmanship improved its performance to its physical limits, while the enchantments lend an opportunity for growth. After Grand Sorceress Alzalsar has bestowed the sword with powerful enchantments, craftsman Smith further modified the sword using mysterious and terrifying means. Once this sword becomes widely known, plays a role in the user's ascent to a legend, or absorbs enough souls, the item will become legendary. Not only could absorb souls to strengthen itself and the user, it was also able to directly harm souls, and the soul bane caused even more additional damage than if it was just a soul armament. Despite using a massive soul, it did not give additional mana. Why? Because of the nature of the inscription Seth had etched into it. Instead of having a specific capacity like most enchantments, it would just become stronger the more mana it had. It even had Overeater, probably from the snake soul, that could store excess energy and use it to strengthen itself even further later. The effect that directly benefited the most from this was strengthening was soul bane. The primal fear anything living felt when looking at the sword, was the effect to deal huge damage directly to the soul. This made the sword absolutely useless to Seth if he wanted to level or collect souls, but it was perfect if his only goal was to kill an opponent. Such as the giant spectre, which didn't even have a real body to protect it from his soul eater sword. "Was this weapon why you were so confident in this fight?" the 13th Ethnarch scoffed. No, the blacksmith answered, amused, when a helmet appeared on his head and his figure suddenly disappeared. Chapter 555. Now you don't. Terrifying, hollow screams echoed across the cityscape of Sigma. The dark skies filled with sinister skeletal entities looked down on a scene of perplexity. Unable to do anything against an invisible foe, deep gauges kept appearing across the body of one of their own. The 13th Ethnarch kept phasing in and out of existence between attacks. Curses that withered stone and steel rained on the buildings, pressure bore down that made them crumble. But in return, it either got no reaction or suffered damage itself, because an earthly haze was trying to wither its body, the curse of the white bull, but this was something it could ignore. Worse was that whatever part was exposed would be slashed, losing chunks and pieces of its spectral body. Sometimes it was a sudden pain without any prior notice, at other times it was an energy blade made of that unrelenting pale fire. All it could do when set aflame was to abandon that part, carving out affected and healthy parts close to them. However, the Ethnarch was not the only one feeling pressed. It was not easy for Seth to evade the carpet bombing, and even if his armor could stop and reflect most of it, being hit by this kind of sorcery was painful and not something the blacksmith enjoyed. If it wasn't for Golden Fleece, he might not have lasted as long as he did. Ding! Your skill, Lame One's Walk Leave 7 had become Lame One's Walk Leave 8. Stepping on one of the glass insect golems he had prepared, he heard a notification he had not expected. Lame One's Walk had leveled up after a long time. This was the other matter that gave the bard a hard time: he had no skill to fly in the sky. That was why he used the golem factory to produce huge numbers of consumable stepping stones. Using the ample resource of glass from the buildings of Sigma, he created these almost invisible flying golems. They were not very sturdy, or useful for anything except being able to hover in place. He had to deploy them, step on them and use feather fall to imitate a kind of flight. With every step and powerful jump, they would crumble below his feet. He had made several hundred, but in the end, they were finite. On one hand, Seth had no idea how much the Ethnarch could take, on the other he had to buy time. To make matters worse, he didn't know how long he himself could withstand it. Even though his armor could reflect most of the damage and he was healed with the skills of the Golden Fleece, with every hit he took he could hear the armor creak and crack dangerously. Still, the benefits he reaped with the ravenous sog were an enticing reason to keep hitting it. With every gouge in the beast's body, the blacksmith could feel a cool stream of power nurturing his soul, and his mana permanently rose by a few points. In addition to that, there were stat increases. With every other hit, he would gain intelligence or willpower. Ugh, the 13th Ethnarch groaned and completely vanished. Seth managed to land on one of the withered and crumbling buildings below. The city was almost completely flattened in the vicinity of their battle. Only the last spire was still standing in the middle of the ruins. The Ethnarch was probably hiding to recover. This meant Seth was close to killing it. Now he somehow had to make it come out again. What was better for this than a taunt? Oh, 13th, did my sword hurt you? Are you afraid? How pitiful for one of the Ethnarchs of the beyond to hide from a puny human. A demonic voice echoed through the ruined city and into the skies above. Even when he spoke, the projection of his voice and the helm of Hades made it impossible to make out where it came from. He did not channel anything this time. The voice of Seth, in addition to demonic language, was well fit for this kind of provocation when he filled it with mana. He waited for a moment, but nothing happened. It might not have been enough provocation. He shrugged his shoulders and walked beside the tower, where he suddenly appeared with his helm in his hands. Do you need a little handicap? Here I am. If you don't come out, I will simply destroy that tower and be done with it, he said, patting the wall of the tower. Immediately afterward, huge cracks started appearing on the structure's surface as it sank into the earth. It still stood, but there was no telling for how long. Of course, the blacksmith had not told them what he was about to do, but what he already did. He had already brought out Python beforehand and sent it over to dig out the tower's foundations. Now he only walked over to collect her back to his inventory before showing himself. Whoops, did I do that? He played innocent. Yoo-hoo, an angry roar filled the city. By the time he appeared, the 13th Ethnarch was already before him, charging through the air with incredible speed. The big crocodilian skull opened its maw wide to crush him in one fell swoop. The pesky human crumbled to dust between its mighty jaws before the being crashed into the Tower of Trials, completely shattering it. The blacksmith liked to imagine that its last thoughts were, are humans supposed to crumble to dust, as it bit down on the earth dummy laced with illusion magic. Because in the next moment when it came to a halt, the ravenous sog pierced the beast's skull in a cascade of flames, and Seth empties his mana and mental strength to shove as much spirit fire down its through, into the skeletal body. Like water traveling down a glass pipe, the fire traveling along its body and filling the creature could be seen from the outside. Had it been normal flames, the Ethnarch would have had no worries, because these bodies were just materialization of their power. But the moment the sword had struck, it knew that it was over, as the fire ate away body and soul all the same. The flame had traveled all along the beast's body, and in a matter of moments, the body began to dissolve and vanish. But it did not end there, as the ground started quaking. These were the signs of Eidolon's space formation taking effect. After the body was gone, the blacksmith took off the helm and appeared again. I guess, I won, he called out. Voices answered. Puny human. Don't think you have won just yet. Above the dome in the distance, masses of bones appeared among broiling black clouds. Beams of sickly grey light poured on the dome and destroyed it. From a portal in the sky, a black sludge made up of unimaginable numbers of monsters flooded into the city below. Did you really believe we would allow you to leave? Someone said, the voice oozing with cruelty and joy as it crushed and tortured an ant. Their actions made it obvious that the Ethnarchs did not intend to keep their word. Beasts flooded the city to kill the citizens. Curses and blasts similar to the attacks of the 13th flattened the wards. They did their very best to instantly destroy anything Seth and the people of Sigma had tried so hard to protect, only to find him calm and the city empty. You tricked us. A choir of outrage shook what was left of Sigma. It was the last thing Seth heard before he was swallowed in a flash of bright light. It was true, Seth had not intended to trust in their word, or even his plan completely. After destroying the 12th tower, the blacksmith took his sweet time while Eidolon opened a portal to evacuate the people of Sigma to a Astarta village near Delta. Whether they would stop him before the 12th or not, was the only big risk. Even if the Ethnarchs had not waited until the last moment, they could have already started evacuating people. The next step was challenging them. Challenging them to a duel with the 13th, to be specific. This was necessary in order to buy more time and to free the vampires from their oath. He had even played a trick on them. In case he lost, he still wouldn't have given them his soul. The last step was the simplest. He just had to make sure the last spire fell. Dylan prepared the formations to bring back the parts of Sigma that were brought to the Beyond so that they would activate the moment the last space lock, aka the Tower of Trial, was destroyed. At this point, only Seth and the vampires were still in the Beyond and would be transported back with the rest of the city. Chapter 556. Coming home. When Seth could finally see again, there was a blue sky above his head. It was tinged in a slight violet hue as the evening sun was sinking. He, and the part of Sigma district, were back on Earth. Even though the city was empty and worse for the wear, they had managed to bring it back. The blacksmith summoned Puffles and got on the Evisor's back. "Are we not returning to Delta?" he asked as Seth steered him towards what was left of the wards. "We will take a look at the situation first. We can return to Delta at any time now," he answered. Now that the space locks were dissolved, Seth felt that he could use home call at any time to return to Delta. Before he returned, he wanted to look at how the vampires were faring. Aside from the flood of monsters that were dropped into the wards, the vampires were the only ones present now. Seth's fires had stopped burning a while ago, and as he flew over the city he finally got a look at the aftermath. Most of the city was charred black and burned out. Although the spirit flame had mostly gorged on the masses of monsters, structural damage to the nearby buildings couldn't be avoided. Anything below the 5th floor, glass, stone, concrete, and steel reinforcements, had molten into a homogeneous slag that made the buildings look as if they grew from the ground or were hewn from natural stone spires. The many fallen behemoths of architecture were more than enough evidence to Seth that the city was not structurally sound anymore. It was questionable whether the wish of Sigma's people to return was feasible. The only parts of Sigma district not struck were the outskirts that had not been transported to the Beyond and the wards that had been protected by their barrier. By the time Seth arrived, the group of bloodsuckers had already carved a bloody path for themselves. He found them running through the empty, dilapidated city, outside of the wards. Even with 500 of them, they fell in quite the peril when they were suddenly drowned in beasts. Especially since not all of them were fighters. The bard couldn't tell whether they had lost people, but all of them were injured to some degree and they were running for their lives. Thanks to his soul armaments like Tisiphony's and Megara's rings that improved his regeneration of mental energy and mana, the blacksmith was able to summon a small wall of fire to cut off the path of the monster horde. Puffles and Tatzel, who were not allowed to help before, jammed in and used the chance to bombard the beasts from the sky. There was nothing to gain from them, but Seth understood that they needed a chance to vent. The flood of monsters didn't stop and they had no idea how many there actually were, but it didn't matter for now. Once the pets were satisfied and the vampires had ample time to leave the city, Seth caught up with them using the shuttle. It had become night, but it was no problem since the dark mist that obstructed night vision skills beforehand had lifted. Seth found the group of vampires camping in the forests outside Sigma. Despite being hurt and some looking outright miserable, their faces were all smiles and positive. Some were slightly melancholic, maybe because they lost someone in the flood, but even they had slight smiles on their faces as they looked at the vibrant plant life around them. Seth was unable to truly comprehend how it would have been to live in a dying stretch of land, surrounded by a bizarre and dead world. However, he could imagine that all of them were quite happy to enter a more or less healthy world. Even when Earth was a melting pot of chaos and danger, with the vampire's strength it was a lot better than that hopeless hellhole. In the beginning, Seth still held some hope to rope in the vampires, even without Vlad present. They were a huge force and Seth wasn't quite sure whether they were the blood-sucking kind of vampire and what kind of harm they could add on top of Earth's already existing calamities. He would have liked to know them in his hands for his own and the world's sake, but he dropped this notion quickly. As he approached the group he was overwhelmed with their gratitude and appreciation. All of them blabbered about the great chance he had given them and how they would stay here to rebuild their home and guard the area. The blacksmith had no chance to bring up anything about bringing them along with him and could only smile wryly as he listened to the crowd that dreamed of an almost peaceful life. There was no way he could persuade them. Well, there was, but he would have felt bad about it. After what they went through thanks to their incapable leader, these guys really deserved to pursue their own happiness. They didn't seem like they would turn into a big threat unless provoked by someone. In Seth's book, whoever dared to offend such a mighty race deserved to be wiped out. In the end, he only decided to give them a few rings of Minasmar and told them to come looking for him in Delta, if they really needed to heal at some point. Seth was tired and just wanted to go home, he really didn't care to manage the aftermath, so this seemed like more than enough. The blacksmith gave his farewells and used home call to return to Delta's system church. Nobody noticed his arrival at the church was in chaos. A result of the huge numbers of refugees from Sigma. Seth had no idea why there were so many people when the plan was to send them to a starter village close to Delta, but he also lacked the energy to care. Ignoring the bustle, he walked to the general teleportation hub that was empty at this point. Seth, he heard Simon call out from behind. The priest had noticed him because he was the only one entering the teleport formation. However, Seth didn't answer. He really just wanted to go home to his friends. He gave the priest a wave before he vanished from the hub area and appeared in Minas Mar's entrance hall. "Tower, where is everyone?" he asked out loud. As an answer, a comprehensive holographic map of Minas Mar appeared in front of him, showing the locations of everyone as small named dots. Most people were in their rooms sleeping. The blacksmith remembered that it was already late. Only people like Allison and Mary were still working. Seeing that Mina and the others were not in the tower, he decided to give Mary a visit while he waited for them. "Seth," she exclaimed when the blacksmith appeared in front of her. "You are back," she said with a relieved sigh after calming down. "Yeah, I am, but where are the others?" he asked. "They are in part of the Oath Guard are helping the princess and officials to transfer people from Starta village to Delta," Mary told him. "Why?" Seeing his puzzled look, the scribe started to explain. She explained that after the people of Sigma arrived at the village, it was quite obvious that they couldn't stay there for long. Lena had quickly organized an evacuation to Delta in cooperation with the current leadership of Delta. Aside from the district's forces, adventurers and guilds were also asked to participate with manpower to safely transfer the people from the village to Delta City, across the mountains. Wait. When did all that happen?" he asked, more than confused. The others had left Sigma maybe a few hours before him, but what Mary talked of would have taken days. Dylan already suspected something like this," she mumbled and revealed to Seth that there was a time difference between the Beyond and Earth. Against Seth's expectations, he had not been away for just a week, but 2 weeks. The difference between his arrival and everyone else was in fact several days. Seth could only sigh. It meant he had lost a whole week when there was already little time for whatever the Age of Gods would bring them. "Any other bad news?" "Since I can't wait for them to return, I would like to go and rest," he said tiredly. When Mary assured him that there was nothing that needed his immediate attention, he used the tower function to teleport to his quarters. With which his armor vanished and he wore pajamas instead. The moment his body touched the soft bed, he fell asleep. Chapter 557. Coping. Laying in his bed, Seth sorted his thoughts about this journey. After a good night's sleep, he was too lazy to get out of bed, but his mind was clear and kept wandering back to it, so he decided to consider the result of this quest. The blacksmith still felt like crying when he thought of all the common souls he had to pay for the final step of his plan to work. The worst was that this fight had not even ended the problem, as Sigma was still connected to the Beyond. Who knew what those things would be up to in the future? Sigma was not the only problem. Gamma was turning into a land of the dead, and they didn't even manage to take a look at Omega, the district furthest north. Taking into account that this place also immediately wiped out Starta villages, he couldn't be any better than Sigma. There was a lot to worry about in the north, and the refugees from Sigma were a whole other matter. All of that and the Age of God could be added on top of it. However, he tried to look at it from the positive side. All of this was not necessarily something he had to solve, right? He decided to leave this troublesome stuff to someone made for it. Lena was definitely able to deal with this. On a brighter note, what did he gain? Obviously, there were the 7 dragon scales. The whole reason for this debacle. There was also the unexpected gain of the carapace of Scorpio and the additional blessings of the gods he met. Speaking of materials, he had also managed to get his hands on the bodies of some special flying beasts, and a good amount of rare souls from the 24th Ethnarch. He also gained a bunch of stats and mana through Ravenous Sog, and quite a few of his skills improved. The bard also gained a better understanding of his current prowess. As he finally had the chance, he checked his skills. Skills sometimes came with perks when they leveled up, and one especially caught his attention. When he first got his class, this was one of the skills he looked forward to the most, but he had almost forgotten about it, because it took so long and cost a lot to level it. Soul Trade Leave 3. Why did this skill catch his attention now again? Because the perk that was activated on level 3 was like sending charcoal in snowy weather. Soul Trader, you are able to seal souls into soul contracts and trade them with other soul traders. It was one of the perks he had expected from Soul Trade from the very beginning. Now paying souls to high-ranking demon entities to improve skill effects was not his only option anymore. With Soul Trader he would be able to source and sell souls locally with other soul traders if he found some. The knowledge pertaining these soul contracts was naturally injected into him through the skill. It gave him the ability to use leather and ink to create a soul contract, that could act as a physical medium to store souls. But most importantly it also gave him the ability to extract these souls from the soul contracts in his possession. If he could buy soul contracts from other soul traders, he would have a stable source of souls, without having to collect them himself. He had items, he had gold. How great would it be if he didn't have to go to the field himself anymore and just trade with some demon to get his hands on souls? If he looked at this sentence objectively, this didn't sound quite right, but he was too excited to really care about the acquisition methods of his business associates, for now. In a good mood, Seth faced one of the biggest questions: what was he going to make out of the dragon scale and the scorpion carapace? After his recent fight in Sigma, Seth had to admit that his current equipment did not make the cut anymore. The carapace was more than enough to make a full, sleek-looking set of plate armor, and Seth could add the dragon scales in important places. The blacksmith thought about the question of which items he would want to exchange. He started with those he would definitely keep, like the gloves of the fire spirit, the golden fleece, and sky clothes. Technically everything else was up for an overhaul. The only thing that made him feel apprehensive was the one effect he was unable to replicate. Curse, reflect, the result of a very lucky and dangerous crafting process where he unknowingly used the cursed hide of the white bull. No matter how good the wyvern cuirass's effects were, it was lacking. Even as the wyvern set. Despite the divine enchantment, the armor had come close to breaking. He didn't know where on the scale the 13th ethnarch was, but with the age of gods more strong enemies would come. He couldn't risk losing his life because he was unwilling to let go. The wyvern set and other items had served him well. They had accompanied him for a long time, but he had to get used to the fact that it was time for a change. Before he started designing his new armor, he got up and ready for the day. Although he really wanted to have a break before he jumped back into working, Seth couldn't help himself. At this point, he had really become a blacksmith with heart and soul. To him, creating something new was something relaxing, even when it was taxing. Since Mina, Finn, and the others weren't here, taking a real break didn't seem as enticing as it would have usually been. Seth, you are finally back. Link greeted him happily. The blacksmith greeted him back. They chatted a little, but the gourmet hunter already knew the gist of what happened from the other who returned before him. This time Seth didn't leave the monster corpses he brought back with the hunter. From the flying beasts he brought with him he wanted to make golems in a similar way he made the minotaur. Especially the griffins were enticing to him. But his armor came first. After a meal, he went to the workshop, where he was greeted by Whedon and Hone. The two dwarves were already working hard. Seeing the row of foundries Hone had made, Seth remembered that he forgot to ask Mary how that idea of his was going. But it could wait, the blacksmith had more interesting matters. Hey, you guys wanna see something really cool? Seth asked with a mischievous smile. Did you bring back an interesting material? Whedon asked with glittering eyes. Hone stayed silent but also looked interested. What dwarven craftsman could resist a new material? Seth brought out the chest Apollo had given him. It had already lost its luster, looking dark and old. He could read from their faces that the two dwarfs were not really impressed by the rusty chest. However, their eyes ripped wide open and their jaws fell to the floor when he lifted the lid. Seth revealed a stack of pristine dragon scales neatly stored in the chest. The container had completely sucked up the curse that plagued them. Are those real? Hone asked with a shaking voice. It can be. Whedon whispered bewildered. Yes, gentlemen. These are real legendary dragon scales. You can't imagine the ordeal I went through to get my hands on these, the bard bragged smugly. Did you come to make something using these? Hone couldn't help but stutter. Yeah, I plan to incorporate them in my new armor. I came to work on the blueprints. Can we watch? The two asked in sync with sparkling eyes. Seth looked at them a little embarrassed. He really was only going to make the blueprints now, there was nothing much to see. How about this, I will call you when I start working on the armor and let you watch, he suggested. The two still seemed unwilling to leave but finally agreed and left his workshop after much persuasion. With the two gone, Seth could finally sit down and rack his brain on how exactly to continue from here. Chapter 558. Curse of Materials. This was the real curse of great materials. He felt incredibly apprehensive about just starting and wanted to plan every step beforehand. He started off by thoroughly investigating the effects of the materials. Although Blacksmith's eyes could give him a catalog entry at first glance, but he could gather more specific information with a closer investigation. The dragon scales were a rather obvious matter. Testing with them using the blueprint skill, he was able to predict their abilities. Aside from their impressive sturdiness, they were able to negate 85% of incoming magical damage. It was said that dragons were immune to magic, however, Seth guessed that there might be a specific skill needed for full immunity, or they had been corroded by time. The blacksmith was sure there was more, but the other abilities couldn't be calculated by the skill. Next, he investigated the scorpion shell. Its inherent capabilities were agility, earth affinity, and negating weapon damage. In addition, it was filled with demonic power and the blessing of Apollo, which were in a fragile balance. The former was straightforward, it lent the effect to improving demonic skills and darkness affinity. Apollo's power, on the other hand, was rather ambiguous. With sunlight, archery, poetry, healing, and music, the Olympian god had many domains. Since all of them were present in the power that inhibited the carapace, they mixed without giving a specific effect. He realized that if he wanted to tap into the power of Apollo's blessing, he would have to add enchantments to the items or use materials to break the equilibrium with the demonic energy and give a medium for a specific domain of Apollo's power to sow itself. Maybe he could use specific souls to trigger one of the powers to step forward. He still had Cleobum's soul, but it seemed a little bit of a waste to use his ego soul for this. Seth found the idea of putting him into his own flute and using him like ounce very enticing. In general, Seth was averse to using special souls, as he wanted to use this chance to implement some more of the Olympian blessing. He had unlocked quite a lot of them since his skills kept leveling up and they only needed the raw power of the souls, not special properties. It was a shame that most of them were more fit to be used on weapons, than on armor. As for the souls he would use, since he had spent most of his ordinary souls in the beyond, his only backup plan was the fragments of the 24th Ethnarch. However, first Seth wanted to give soul trading a try and pay a visit to the demon district. He could still come back to the fragments if that didn't work. The blacksmith created a few blueprints using his skill, but they still lacked any designs for enchantments. Another thing he added to his to-do list, before starting the real work, was visiting Alzalsar and getting her advice. With a rough plan in mind, Seth got up and summoned the smithy. The first point on his list to make his new armor was to make a preparatory piece of armor. There was one special enchantment that was unlocked with Leave 6 Craftsman, and it was perfect to create a counterpart to the Wraith Guard. The blessing of Hephaestus, which would obviously improve his skills as a blacksmith and their effects. One gauntlet for the body, one gauntlet for the soul. It was quite fitting. The reason Seth had not done so earlier was because he still lacked a soul to fully complete it. But if he really wanted to start with his new armor, this was an indispensable item. He still had hopes for soul trade. If he really found one or several soul traders, he might be able to purchase a fitting soul and finish the gauntlet before starting on the armor. But for now, he could only make the item itself. Seth didn't worry much about the design, since he wanted it to be a pair with the Wraithguard. He simply adopted the design for Gibran's work. The only difference was that he did intend to use Olympian silver for his own creation. The blacksmith didn't bother using a demonic ballad on the gauntlet, as he intended to use the god's blessing on the gauntlet itself and not the soul. It would overwrite everything anyways. Instead, he concentrated on perfect form and finish. Aside from the Olympian silver, he also used some Minotaur leather for the inner glove, to see if he could gain the skill effects with it. After several hours of meticulous work at the anvil, he held a finished silver gauntlet in his hands. It looked pristine and a perfect copy of Wraithguard, but for the right instead of the left hand. He brought the gauntlet to a work table where Seth brought out his engraving tool. The sigil of the god of craftsmen resembled predictably a heavily stylized hammer and anvil. Setting the engraver on the back of the gauntlet, he suddenly felt a benevolent gaze on his back. It had been a while since he experienced this, but he had to admit that it was a lot more pleasant than channeling a demon god. Under the watchful gaze of one of his patron gods, Seth became hyper-focused as he carefully carved the sigil into the epic silver metal. Sweat was pouring down his forehead when he finished, and a very technical pattern spread from the sigil, covering the full piece in intricate carvings. Shortly after, he got the notification that the item was finished. Forge right. Special. Physical damage, 400. Mag damage, 400. Physical DEF 1500. Mag DEF 1300. Durability 2500. 1 allows working with all materials. 2 active skill, absolute focus. 3 passive skill, craftsman's precision. 4 improves in synergy with all forging equipment. 5 improves in synergy with skill, blacksmith. 6 improves in synergy with skill, goldsmith. 7 improves in synergy with skill, golem artisan. 8 plus 10% skill effects. A magnificent gauntlet created by the hands of craftsman Smith with the help of divine intervention. Any blacksmith would give a leg to call this gauntlet his own. Requirements: blessed of Hephaestus. He couldn't tell whether this was what it should be or Hephaestus played a little prank by almost perfectly mirroring the effects of the Wraith Guard, except that his options focused on the skills of a blacksmith. The passive skill craftsman's precision improved the effects of items by up to 20%, by helping Seth work even cleaner. The active skill absolute focus could double his crafting speed at the cost of mental energy. All other options were self-explanatory in his opinion. Like this, it was already comparable to the Wraith Guard. If he could find a fitting soul and further enchant it, Forge Right would definitely become even better than the dwarf's legacy item. He put on the silver glove, together with the copper one, and could help his childish glee when everything fit perfectly. He kept opening and closing his fist and playing around. There was something powerful about wearing gauntlets. Satisfied with his day's work, the blacksmith leaned back and relaxed. He had not even started working on his new armor, but he felt like he lifted a great weight off his soul. Feeling his stomach asking for attention, he looked at the clock. Late afternoon? Time for a meal, he thought to himself, and got up. Right outside the door he caught 2 childlike dwarves impishly eavesdropping on his workshop. I can explain, we heard hammer strikes and Hone tried to justify their actions. Did you already start working with the scales? The younger Whedon didn't think about holding back and asked the important questions. No, I didn't. I still need some stuff before I start with the armor. You guys want to grab a bite of the kitchen? He invited them and started walking without waiting for an answer. Mike? Mina? Finn? Guys? What's up with the long faces? He asked as he walked in. The whole party was sitting in the cafeteria with dull and melancholic faces, and they all looked tired. Seth. Their faces lit up, seeing he had finally returned. Mina jumped up, pulling him into an abrupt kiss. The blacksmith did not stand at ceremony and enjoyed their reunion. When they finally separated, Seth and the dwarfs joined the party at the tables. Chapter 559. News arrive. As they waited for their food, they talked about what happened. When Seth and the others started talking about what happened on their quest in Sigma, Hone and Whedon realized that they had been so distracted by the dragon scales, that they missed to ask the Tower Master for what actually happened. The food came and they kept talking about what happened over the meal. The members of Uelakat's Fur were so tired because they had been on action 24/7 since they returned. Although Sigma had been depopulated before they came there, the refugees still numbered several million people. The most chaos was during the transportation, but it didn't become much better once all people arrived in the starter village that was obviously way too small to take in all of them. Until Lena managed to get reinforcement from Delta, there had been a huge horde of people filling the vicinity around the village. Since the vampires were left in Sigma, they needed every able person to make sure the herd wasn't wiped out by a strong monster from the mountains. Although the area around Delta was relatively safe, it didn't mean nothing could go wrong. With the forces from Delta arriving, the people were slowly guided to Delta District, where they were put in provisional camps before appropriate space could be found or made. Delta was lucky in the aspect that they were not hit as hard by the events since Apocalypse, as other districts like Beta or Epsilon. It also meant that they didn't have as much readily available empty room to take in refugees as Y City had. Not to mention that Delta was the smallest district and already offered a part of it to the demons. They had barely been able to accommodate the people of Gamma. Mina and the others had spent the last days helping in the evacuation of the people from Sigma and finally got the chance to return when they heard that Seth had returned. Listening to their gripes brought his mindset back into the moment. He had used the project of his new armor as a small escape and break from the stress he had went through over the past few days. Although he had a one-track mind for creating his new armor, he realized he had a lot of other things he needed to take care of and look after. With a more or less clean consciousness, he decided to leave all the big stuff to Lena and that people whose job it was to think of the big picture. Sigma was pacified for now. Gamma, Omega, and the refugee? He could also leave to officials. If anything, he was sure Mary had already taken the appropriate steps for Mina's Mars role in this situation. He would still ask her about it later. Other questions were more pressing for him. Such as the situation with the trading route, Drosy and the Tijake were still en route, distributing the golems, and the chimeras had probably already started clearing the way towards Y City. These were the people he cared for, so obviously it had a higher priority. Judging by Hohn's foundries in the workshop, the accessory business was going well, but it was also a situation he wanted to keep an eye on. Same as their certificates for the items. It wasn't the right moment now, but he would approach Hohn later in the workshop before having a talk with Mary to stay up to date. He would have liked to spend some more time with Mina and the others, but they were really tired and wanted to wash up and get some rest. Then I will see you later in the bedroom. Seth separated from the tired Mina before everyone got to their rooms. Since all the business talk was a tiresome matter, the blacksmith decided to get it over as fast as possible. When he and the dwarfs returned to the workshop, he had a talk with Hohn. Jane had worked quick and set up the copper anvil, their new outlet for low-tier equipment, in a matter of days. As Seth had suspected, despite being really cheap and basic accessories, Hohn burned through the ores they had mined as the products were sold like hotcakes. After Seth left, Hohn had also made some foundries for simple pendants, which meant that customers could completely satisfy their needs for magical accessories with one visit to the copper anvil. The blacksmith couldn't help but gloat when he thought of how this was probably a mean dent in the business of merchants that sold overpriced imported items. Since they got the ores technically for free, their prices were unbeatable. At least not by imported goods. Seth, or in this case Jane, still had a conscience and didn't press the price below the point that locals couldn't compete anymore. These were cheap products after all and lacked most of the augmentation they could have if they were made personally by a blacksmith. With this dissemination, Seth also gave the blacksmiths of Delta a chance to learn enchantments and compete with them. A blacksmith or goldsmith who managed to copy the engravings would be able to make a slightly better version of these accessories. So they would be able to make a living. Jane had decided to sell at a price that was still far lower than the imported items, but not much cheaper than it would be if made by a local. These were the things Seth had talked about with Jane and it seemed to work for the moment. Hohn didn't really know anything about the other matters, so Seth decided to go and look for Mary. The person in question was gloomily brooding over some documents when Seth entered the office. He used the door this time, instead of just teleporting in front of her desk. She looked up, not surprised about who would enter her office without knocking. Great timing. I have news, she said ominously. Seth walked to her desk and sat down opposite her. Pray tell, what bombed your mood like that? He asked curiously. Mark Baker is dead. He stared at her for a while in surprise. He hadn't expected this. Baker was pretty strong and not stupid as far as Seth knew, so it was probably not an accident. Seeing that he understood the implication of the news, Mary continued. Y City is in chaos and things are changing. Baker was one of the few who understood how important it is for the districts that are left to work together. The current movement in Epsilon's leadership is pushing for isolation, rather than strengthening our connections. Without him. She left the sentence open-ended. It was pretty clear what it meant. When Seth left, their negotiation with Y City concerning the trade route had not been finalized. Seeing Mary's mood, it had not been finished before Mark left the realm of the living. Then what is the current status of the negotiations? He bit the bullet and asked. What do you think? Everything is on ice and it doesn't look positive, Mary said depressed. Then we should contact the Adventurer Guild now and call back the Chimeras. Seth stayed calm even in the face of bad news. Since Y City's stance was uncertain, there was no reason to clear the way before they had an agreement. Worst case they would just steal the rights afterwards. The blacksmith had no illusions about the benevolence of people. He was sure people would try to snatch it, especially if Minas Mar had no official assurance. They wouldn't put in the work just for others to reap the rewards. Why do you want to contact the guild? Mary understood why they called back the Chimeras but not why Seth wanted to call the Adventurer Guild. They would have approached us anyways once the route went public. The guild would push to build a small branch at any greater dungeon in the wild, like the one Seth had farmed a couple of weeks ago. There was even a possibility of small villages forming. It would have been great if they could build a trade channel with Epsilon, but he didn't need them to make profit from it. Minas Mar could just open the trade route all the way up to Mount Agra and profit from the dungeon business along the way. Seth also doubted that independent merchants and caravans would stop using the mountain road to trade with Delta. With the opening of the route, anyone from Y City would probably aim for the mountain city and then use Minas Mar's safe road. I see. Mary's face lit up. She had been too reoccupied by the business with Y City to see the lower hanging fruits. With the golems and trees the maintenance was technically free. Any business would mean profit for them. It was Y-City's loss, not theirs. Chapter 560. The Fairy and the Cat. After enlightening her they talking for a little more. When Seth asked, Mary also told him that Drosy and his company had already reached Mount Agra and would return soon. Seth had been a little worried when he didn't see the group during his initial scan of the tower. Since they would call back the chimeras, there was also the question of their future. The blacksmith shared a few ideas pertaining to this with Mary, but ultimately he wanted to leave this choice to the individuals in question. There would be more than enough work along the route, if they didn't want to fight for their whole life. He didn't even want to forcefully bind them to Mina's march. They seemed quite happy in the mountain city and Seth would not stop them if they chose to settle there. Maybe Seth had a change of heart, or maybe unlocking the option to create a buttload of strong, mindless drone soldiers had made him less desperate to amass power. Although he had to admit that having the vampires would have been very enticing. Everything else was working smoothly for now. Mary had only praise for Jane's handling of the new shop. Although a group of obviously enraged merchants seemed to be trying to make some trouble lately. Seth heard this with a smile and would visit Jane to talk about this matter. At least the implementation of the unique certificate tokens had worked well and showed the first results. Copycats wouldn't vanish in a week or two, but the problem was already a lot less prevalent since people would start asking for authentication. It worked so well, that Jane had even hired a talented appraiser. Now they offered, besides appraising services, the possibility to issue certificates for a previously bought item. Hearing that everything except their biggest project was going rather smoothly calmed Seth a lot. As he had expected, Mary had also made sure that Minasmar was doing their part in disaster relief. They talked for a while longer about Seth's personal plans and more generic stuff, before Seth finally excused himself. Transporting into his quarters, he found Mina fast asleep. Carefully he snuck to her under the blanket and fell asleep. The two spent the whole morning celebrating their reunion before Mina regretfully had to wash up and leave. She wanted to stay with Seth, but their party had promised to help with the evacuation efforts and the management of refugees in Delta. That was why the cat lady had to rein in her desires and make do with a morning of passion for now. Their party traveled to Delta's system church, from where they followed Lena's orders. Their task was relatively simple, as it was to help in guiding and protecting the huge number of people that arrived from outside. As pure adventurers, Mina and the other members of Yule Cat's Fur were not used to this kind of work. It was time for the Oath Guard to shine. As people trained by a former policeman and detective, Jack Felton, they were proficient in keeping public order. Many of them had already gained some experience in this during the Theocracy incident. Mina couldn't hide a mischievous smile, when their team split up and she was alone with Finn. "What?" Finn asked when she couldn't take the cat stare anymore. "How's practice going?" she asked curiously. Finn sighed. Ever since the fairy had told them about the ancient magic for shape-shifting, Mina had kept asking. She had been really touched when Mina offered her support, but she didn't expect that Mina was even more eager to have her join them than she was. It's harder than Finn thought," the fairy explained, a little depressed and embarrassed. She practiced in her room when she had time, but it was surprisingly hard to change shape into something specific, not to mention keeping that shape. Since it was an ancient magic and not a skill, she had to not just practice but also understand it. "Shall I tell you something to cheer you up?" "It's a secret and you can't tell Seth that I told you," she offered secretive. The fairy's eyes shone. She loved secrets. Especially if it was about knowing the secrets of others. She nodded excitedly and prompted Mina to tell. "Good. Listen closely. This is something Seth told us not to tell you, but do you remember that Minotaur Seth talked about before we went to Sigma?" she whispered. "Yes." Finn's eyes shone like searchlights. "Seth actually finished it some time ago. It's stationed as gate guardian at the gatehouse," she revealed to the fairy brute. Mina felt a little bad about revealing the secret, since Seth's reasons were sound. Asterion was sentient, and once Finn's expression lit up, she knew that she would pester the poor guy from now on. Maybe he had made a mistake. What if the little brute would turn to stalk the Minotaur and forget to practice? Try to be subtle about it. Okay, she tried to do damage control, but she wasn't sure whether Finn even knew what subtlety was. At least the fairy seemed a lot happier now, even if that meant she had possibly ruined someone else's future days. The two were patrolling the vicinity and it had been a rather relaxed day up to now. A panicked crowd suddenly came running in their direction from up ahead. Mina vanished in the shadows and Finn flew over the crowd to reach the scene. On one side of the road lay a party of bleeding, unconscious adventurers. It was unknown whether they were even still alive. On the other side, they saw a party of their Oath Guard defending against an invisible attacker, if one could call that defending. Bright sparks kept flying all over the place when the attackers' weapons failed to overcome the Oath armor. Although they were on guard, they were helpless against the invisible enemy. The armor was the only reason they were still alive, but it did not stop them from being battered. "Go for it, I will give support," Finn said seriously, and his assassin vanished back into the shadows. The fairy couldn't see them, just like the Oath Guard members, but Mina was different. She was a beastman, her senses were a lot better than many other races. Even if she didn't see them, she could track their scent and sound. She appeared from the shadows of the Oath Guards in the middle of their circle, and together with her, rows of shadow spikes shot out from the ground and pierced the supposedly empty air. Blood splattered in several locations. Blood soaked into the air in some places, while the disembodied wound tried to run. The floating wound was promptly pummeled by a tiny figure that was almost invisible, as she was too fast and small for human eyes to spot. Mina also pursued some of the wound and incapacitated the invisible people. "Some got away," Mina said with a frown when she came over to Finn, after hunting down all the attackers she could get a hold of. Seeing the danger was over, the Oath Guard members finally relaxed and scratched their heads a little embarrassed. They had been unable to react and were even seen by their superiors. They had also been unable to help their fellow adventurers and could only look at their corpses guiltily. Finn had already checked them, but most had died with a single attack, the others were beyond saving by the point they arrived. "Did you catch some alive?" Mina nodded, but when they got to check them, they found that it wasn't they. Their bodies appeared when they stripped off a thing from the cape they were wearing. They became visible only for the party to see that they had foam in front of their mouths. The attackers had actually committed suicide in this short amount of time, leaving them with no way to gain information from them. Just who were these people? Soon the guard and other adventurers arrived with Lena at their helm.